Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through the Stuart Crisis and the English Civil War, a profound conflict that forever transformed the nature of monarchy and power in Britain from 1642 to 1651. We'll softly explore the seeds of religious tension, the clash between divine right and parliamentary authority, the rise of Oliver Cromwell's forces, and the unprecedented trial and execution of a king, all while the very foundations of British governance were being reshaped. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to invite you to be part of our gentle community. If you're enjoying these soothing historical journeys, a simple like means the world and helps others find these calming tales. And if you're feeling brave, I know some of you are wonderfully shy, drop a comment telling me which historical period you'd love to explore next, or simply say, hello. Your thoughts always brighten my day. And of course, subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers seeking restful sleep through history's whispers. So settle into your softest blanket, let your breathing slow, close your eyes, and allow the gentle echoes of 17th century England, the rustle of banners, the quiet prayers in candlelit chapels, and the soft murmur of a kingdom transforming, to carry you toward the most peaceful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. In the year 1603, as spring blossoms opened across the English countryside and winter's last frost melted from castle stones, a new dynasty arrived to claim the throne. The Tudor age, with all its glory and turmoil, had drawn to a gentle close with the death of Queen Elizabeth I. She left no heir, no child to carry forward her bloodline, and so the crown passed northward across the border to Scotland, where James Stuart, already king of that realm, prepared to journey south and unite two ancient kingdoms under one royal hand. James arrived in London that summer, welcomed by crowds who lined the dusty roads and tossed flowers before his horse. He was a learned man, a scholar king who had penned books on theology and the divine right of monarchs, believing with absolute certainty that kings were appointed by God himself and answered to no earthly power. This conviction would echo through the coming decades, shaping conflicts that would tear the realm apart. But in those early days, hope filled the air. Two kingdoms, England and Scotland, now shared a sovereign, and many dared to dream of peace and prosperity. Yet beneath this hopeful surface, old tensions simmered quietly, like embers waiting for wind. England remained a patchwork of religious beliefs and political loyalties. The Reformation of the previous century had established the Protestant Church of England, breaking away from the authority of Rome and the Pope. But this transformation had satisfied neither the Catholics, who mourned their lost faith and practiced in secret, nor the Puritans, those strict Protestants who believed the Reformation had not gone far enough, that too many Catholic rituals and hierarchies remained embedded in Anglican practice. The countryside itself reflected these divisions. In grand manor houses, Catholic families kept their faith alive in hidden chapels behind false walls. In market towns, Puritan ministers preached sermons calling for simpler worship, for the removal of bishops and elaborate ceremonies they deemed prideful and ungodly. And in the middle, the majority of English subjects attended their parish churches, following the Book of Common Prayer, perhaps not deeply concerned with theological debates, but aware of the tension crackling through their society like distant thunder before a storm. Parliament, that ancient assembly of nobles and commons, had grown in power during the Tudor years. It held a crucial authority. Only Parliament, could legally approve new taxes. This power had been reluctantly conceded by medieval kings desperate for funds to wage wars, and now it stood as a check upon royal ambition. When the crown needed money beyond its traditional revenues, it had to call Parliament, present its case, and negotiate. This created an uneasy balance, a dance of power between monarch and representatives that could turn graceful or stumble into discord depending on the personalities and circumstances of the moment. King James understood this dance well enough. He had ruled Scotland since childhood and knew how to maneuver among fractious nobles. In England, he generally managed to work with Parliament, though not without friction. His extravagant spending on court festivities and his generous gifts to favorites raised eyebrows and emptied treasury coffers. His tolerance of Catholic rituals in his Queen's Chapel made Protestants nervous. His insistence on his divine right to rule grated against those in Parliament who believed monarchy should answer to law and custom. But James possessed enough political skill to avoid outright confrontation. He bent when necessary, delayed when advantageous, and maintained a precarious peace. The religious landscape presented challenges beyond the Catholic-Protestant divide. Within Protestantism itself, different visions competed. The Church of England, as established by law, maintained bishops, elaborate vestments, ornate ceremonies, and a hierarchical structure that resembled, in many ways, the Catholic Church from which it had separated. Puritans found this intolerable. They envisioned a purer church, stripped of what they considered popish elements. No bishops dictating to congregations, no kneeling at communion rails, no vestments draping ministers like peacocks, no set prayers read from books, but spontaneous prayers rising from sincere hearts. These theological disagreements might seem abstract or minor to modern minds, but in the 17th century, religion shaped every aspect of existence. It determined how one prayed, where one's soul might spend eternity, what authority one recognized, and ultimately, what kind of society one inhabited. When Puritans argued for simpler churches, they also argued for a more egalitarian world, where authority rose from congregations rather than descending from hierarchies. When bishops defended ceremonial worship, they defended an ordered world where everyone knew their place and respected their betters. Religion and politics, faith and power, wound together like threads in a tapestry, impossible to separate. Scotland added another layer of complexity to this already intricate picture. The Scottish Kirk, their national church, followed a Presbyterian model, governed by assemblies of ministers and elders rather than bishops. Scots felt passionately protective of their Kirk, having fought to establish it against Catholic monarchs and English interference. When James tried to impose bishops on Scotland, he stirred resentment. When he suggested the Scots should adopt practices from the English prayer book, he struck at their national pride and religious convictions simultaneously. Ireland presented yet another religious challenge. The majority of Irish people remained Catholic, despite Protestant English and Scottish settlers being planted in Ulster during Elizabeth's reign. These settlers, a minority but a powerful one, controlled much of the land and local government. They viewed the native Catholic Irish with suspicion and fear, while the Irish resented their dispossession and the suppression of their faith. This volatile mixture needed only a spark to ignite into violence. Economic tensions also divided the realm. England's population had grown dramatically during the previous century, from perhaps 3 million to over 5 million souls. This growth strained resources. Food prices rose steadily, outpacing wages. Small farmers struggled to feed their families, while landlords enclosed common lands to create profitable sheep pastures, displacing tenant farmers who had worked those lands for generations. In towns, craftsmen organized into guilds, complained about royal monopolies granted to favourites, which limited their ability to trade freely. Merchants in London and port cities accumulated wealth through expanding trade networks, but inland regions felt left behind, disconnected from the prosperity flowing through maritime commerce. The poor, that vast portion of English society who owned little beyond the clothes on their backs, and perhaps a few simple possessions, lived precarious lives. A bad harvest could mean starvation, an injury could mean begging. Old age brought dependence on charity from the parish poor relief system, itself chronically underfunded and reluctantly administered. For these people, political and religious disputes among their betters might have seemed distant and irrelevant, yet when civil war eventually came, they would be the ones most affected. Their homes destroyed, their fields trampled by armies, their sons pressed into service to fight for causes they barely understood. King James died in 1625, after 22 years on the English throne. He had maintained peace, avoided foreign wars as much as possible, patronized learning and the arts, and handed to his son a kingdom that was stable, if troubled by underlying tensions. That son was Charles, a young man who would prove far less flexible than his father, far more committed to his principles, and tragically unable to read the changing moods of his subjects. Charles the Versoren would reign for 24 years before losing not just his throne, but his head, in an execution that shocked Europe and proved that even divine right could not protect a king who pushed his people too far. Charles Stuart was born on November 19, 1600, at Dunfermline Palace in Scotland, a cold stone fortress overlooking the Firth of Forth. He entered the world weak and small, a sickly infant whom no one expected to survive infancy, let alone ascend to the throne of 2 kingdoms. His parents, James VI of Scotland and Queen Anne of Denmark, had already produced an heir, Prince Henry, a robust, charming boy who seemed destined for greatness. Charles was merely the spare, the second son, and given his poor health, perhaps not even that. The young Charles could not walk or talk at an age when other children ran and chattered. His ankles were so weak that he required metal braces to support them. A stammer afflicted his speech, making words tumble awkwardly from his mouth. He was small for his age, painfully shy, and overshadowed by his vigorous older brother whom everyone admired. When the family moved to England in 1603, after James inherited the English crown, they initially left Charles behind in Scotland, fearing he was too frail to survive the journey. Only when physicians judged him stronger did he finally travel south to join his family. In England, young Charles found himself in a magnificent but intimidating world. The English court was grander than anything Scotland offered, filled with nobles in silk and jewels, with elaborate ceremonies and subtle hierarchies that a small, stammering boy struggled to navigate. His brother Henry shone in this environment, tall, athletic, beloved by the court and commons alike. Charles adored Henry, following him devotedly, trying to please him, but always aware he could never match his brother's effortless confidence. Then, in 1612, tragedy struck. Prince Henry fell ill with typhoid fever. For days he lingered, racked with chills and fever, while physicians applied their useless remedies, and the court held its breath. On November 6, 1612, the prince died. He was just 18 years old. England mourned him as the golden prince they had lost, the king they would never have. For Charles, now suddenly heir to the throne, Henry's death was devastating. He had lost his beloved brother and inherited a burden he had never expected to carry. From that moment, Charles's life changed fundamentally. No longer the spare, but the heir. He received intensive education in kingship, politics, and the responsibilities of rule. His father's advisors tutored him in statecraft. He learned languages: French, Latin, Italian, Spanish. He studied theology and political theory, absorbing his father's conviction that kings ruled by divine right, that their authority came directly from God and could not be limited by earthly powers. This belief would become central to Charles's identity, the cornerstone on which he built his understanding of monarchy and his inflexible approach to governance. Charles also developed a deep love for art and culture. Where his father was a scholar and his brother had been a warrior, Charles became a connoisseur. He collected paintings by the great European masters: Titian, Raphael, Van Dyck, Rubens. His collection would become one of the finest in Europe, though Parliament later sold most of it to raise funds during the Commonwealth. He patronized architects, musicians, and poets. He appreciated beauty, order, and ceremony. The splendor of religious ritual appealed to him. The incense and vestments and carefully choreographed liturgy that made worship an aesthetic as well as spiritual experience. This aesthetic sensibility shaped his religious views. Charles favored what his critics called high church practices: elaborate ceremonies, ornate decorations in churches, ministers wearing traditional vestments, and the elevation of the communion table, which Puritans angrily called an altar, suggesting Catholic Mass. To Charles, these practices honored God through beauty. To Puritans, they represented dangerous backsliding toward Rome, evidence that Charles harbored secret Catholic sympathies, or worse, planned to restore Catholicism to England. These suspicions intensified when Charles married. In 1625, shortly after becoming king, Charles wed Henrietta Maria, the 15-year-old sister of King Louis XIII of France. She was Catholic, devout, and unwilling to compromise her faith. The marriage treaty, negotiated in secret, contained provisions allowing her to practice Catholicism openly and maintain Catholic priests in her household. When these provisions became known, Protestant England reacted with alarm. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, when Catholic conspirators had tried to blow up Parliament and the King, remained vivid in popular memory. The 30 Years' War, that brutal conflict between Catholic and Protestant powers devastating Central Europe, was raging. In this atmosphere, a Catholic queen seemed dangerous, a potential agent of foreign Catholic powers working to subvert English Protestantism. Charles's relationship with Henrietta Maria started poorly. He was shy and awkward. She was young and homesick. They argued frequently in those early years, but gradually they grew to love each other deeply. Henrietta Maria became Charles's closest companion and advisor, the person whose opinion he valued above all others. She bore him 9 children, though only 6 survived childhood. Their devotion to each other would become legendary, a rare example of genuine affection in royal marriages, typically arranged for political advantage. But this devotion also became a political liability, as Charles's critics believed the Catholic queen exercised too much influence over her Protestant husband, poisoning his policies with popish plots. From the beginning of his reign, Charles clashed with Parliament. His foreign policy proved expensive and disastrous. He waged war against Spain and then France simultaneously, both conflicts ending in humiliating defeats. He sent expeditions that accomplished nothing except wasting money and lives. Parliament, asked to fund these failures, balked. They questioned his choice of advisers, particularly George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, who had been King James's favorite and now served Charles. Buckingham was handsome, ambitious, and widely hated. Nobles resented his influence and the titles heaped upon him. Commons blamed him for military disasters. In 1628, a disgruntled officer assassinated Buckingham, an act many secretly applauded. Parliament's criticism infuriated Charles. He believed deeply that as king, chosen by God, he should not have to justify his decisions to subjects. When Parliament presented him with the Petition of Right in 1628, a document asserting that the king could not levy taxes without Parliament's consent, could not imprison subjects arbitrarily, and could not impose martial law in peacetime, Charles reluctantly accepted it. But the humiliation burned. Parliament was trying to limit his God-given authority, to place conditions on royal power, and this struck at the very core of his beliefs about kingship. In 1629, Charles dissolved Parliament. He would not call another for 11 years. This period, known as the Personal Rule, or by his critics the 11 Years' Tyranny, saw Charles attempt to govern without Parliament, financing his administration through traditional royal revenues, feudal rights, and creative legal interpretations that pushed every source of income to its limits. One particularly controversial measure was ship money. Traditionally, coastal towns paid ship money to fund the navy in times of war. Charles extended this tax to inland counties and continued collecting it during peacetime. John Hampden, a wealthy gentleman, refused to pay, arguing that the tax was illegal without Parliament's consent. Charles prosecuted him. The case became a cause célèbre. Though judges ruled in Charles's favor by a narrow margin, the judgment satisfied no one. Many saw it as proof that Charles would twist laws to his purposes, that traditional English liberties were in danger under a king who believed himself above the law. Charles also pursued religious policies that alarmed his Protestant subjects. In 1633, he appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury, giving this controversial cleric authority over the Church of England. Laud shared Charles's love of ceremony and order. He believed the Church needed uniformity, that everyone should worship the same way, using the same prayers and ceremonies. He enforced conformity rigorously, prosecuting ministers who deviated from prescribed forms. Puritans found themselves persecuted, fined, imprisoned, sometimes mutilated. William Prynne, a Puritan lawyer who wrote pamphlets criticizing theater and, by implication, the Queen's love of court masks, had his ears cut off and his cheeks branded. Such brutality created martyrs and intensified Puritan opposition. Laud also insisted on moving communion tables to the east end of churches, railing them off and calling them altars. He required congregants to kneel at communion rails. He reintroduced elaborate vestments and ceremonies that Puritans had tried to eliminate. In their eyes, every change Laud made brought England closer to Catholicism. They called his program Arminianism, after a Dutch theologian whose ideas about salvation differed from strict Calvinist predestination. But the theological label mattered less than the visceral fear that Charles and Laud were betraying the Protestant Reformation, preparing the ground for England's return to Rome. Religious anxiety mixed with political and economic grievances to create a volatile atmosphere. Merchants resented royal monopolies that restricted trade. Lawyers worried about arbitrary imprisonment without habeas corpus. Landowners complained about ship money and other taxes they deemed illegal. Puritans feared for their souls and their liberties, and ordinary people watched nervously as tension mounted between their king and their parliament, between their monarch's insistence on divine right and their traditional understanding that English kings ruled under the law, not above it. Yet during these 11 years, England knew peace. There were no battles, no civil disorder beyond occasional protests against unpopular taxes. The king governed, the courts functioned, merchants traded, farmers planted and harvested. Life continued its familiar rhythms. Charles believed he had proven that he could rule successfully without Parliament, that strong kingship needed no representative assembly questioning every decision. But he had not solved the underlying problems. He had merely postponed their reckoning. And when Scotland rebelled in 1637, the fragile peace of the personal rule shattered, setting in motion events that would lead to civil war, the king's trial, and an execution that shocked the world. On a summer Sunday in 1637, in the ancient city of Edinburgh, Scotland, a riot erupted that would ultimately bring down a king. St. Giles Cathedral, the heart of Scottish religious life, filled with worshippers that morning, expecting their familiar Presbyterian service. Instead, the dean appeared in elaborate vestments and began reading from a new prayer book, one imposed by King Charles without consulting the Scottish Kirk. The congregation, shocked and outraged, erupted. A woman named Jenny Geddes supposedly threw her stool at the dean's head, shouting, "Devil cause you colic in your stomach, false thief. Dare you say Mass in my ear?" Chaos spread through the cathedral as people yelled, threw objects, and physically attacked clergy trying to conduct the new service. The riot at St. Giles was spontaneous, but not surprising. Charles had badly misread Scotland. He believed that as king of both realms, he could impose uniformity, bringing Scottish religious practice into line with English forms. He and Archbishop Laud had prepared a new prayer book for Scotland, modeled on England's Book of Common Prayer, but with changes they thought would make it acceptable to Scots. They were wrong. The prayer book included ceremonies Scots considered popish, kneeling at communion, calling tables altars, elaborate rituals. Moreover, it was being imposed without consent, forced on Scotland by a king who spent most of his time in England and understood little about Scottish religious sensibilities. Resistance spread rapidly from Edinburgh across Scotland. Presbyterian ministers denounced the prayer book from their pulpits. Nobles who resented Charles's interference with the Scottish Kirk joined the protest. In Edinburgh, crowds mobbed bishops in the streets. The Scottish Privy Council, Charles's representatives in Scotland, lost control. In February 1638, thousands gathered in Edinburgh's Greyfriars churchyard to sign a document called the National Covenant. This covenant pledged signers to defend the Presbyterian Kirk against innovations and to resist anything that smacked of popery. Copies circulated throughout Scotland, and nobles, lairds, ministers, and common people signed by the thousands. Scotland was uniting in defiance of its king. Charles faced a dilemma. He could back down, withdrawing the hated prayer book, and accepting that Scotland would worship as it chose. This would be humiliating, an admission that subjects could defy royal commands with impunity. It might embolden English Puritans to make similar demands. Charles's entire philosophy of divine right kingship argued against compromise. Kings commanded, subjects obeyed. If he yielded to Scottish defiance, what would that say about his authority? Yet if he insisted, how could he enforce his will? Scotland was far away, with difficult terrain and a population now united against him. An army would be needed. Charles chose confrontation. In 1639, he raised an army to march north and compel Scottish obedience. This first Bishops' War proved disastrous. Charles's English army was poorly trained, inadequately supplied, and unenthusiastic about fighting fellow Protestants. Many soldiers sympathized with the Scots, or simply had no desire to risk death over prayer books and ceremonies. The Scottish Covenanter army, by contrast, burned with religious fervor, and was led by experienced officers who had fought in European wars. When the two forces faced each other near Berwick, Charles recognized he could not win. He negotiated a truce, the pacification of Berwick, which resolved nothing but allowed both sides to back away from immediate battle. The truce bought time, but no solution. Scotland remained in covenant, refusing the prayer book and now demanding that bishops be abolished from the kirk entirely. Charles, humiliated and determined to impose his authority, decided to raise a larger, better army and try again. But this required money, far more money than his personal revenues could provide. After 11 years of ruling without Parliament, Charles had no choice. He needed Parliament's consent to raise the funds necessary to fight Scotland. In April 1640, Charles summoned Parliament. He expected them to understand the Scottish threat, to support their king against rebellious subjects, and to grant the taxes he needed. Instead, Parliament saw opportunity. For 11 years they had been silenced, unable to voice grievances, watching as Charles pursued policies they despised. Now suddenly, the king needed them. Before granting any money, Parliament wanted to discuss grievances, ship money, religious policies, arbitrary arrests, the whole catalogue of complaints accumulated during the personal rule. Charles had no patience for this. He wanted money, not debates about his governance. After just 3 weeks, he dissolved Parliament in frustration. This became known as the Short Parliament, the briefest session in centuries. But dissolving Parliament solved nothing. The king still needed money for the army he was assembling to invade Scotland. He tried various expedients, forced loans, confiscations, appeals to wealthy subjects, but raised insufficient funds. Meanwhile, Scotland prepared to defend itself. In August 1640, the Scots took the initiative. Rather than wait for Charles to invade, the Covenanter army crossed into England, quickly capturing Newcastle and defeating English forces at the Battle of Newburn. Newcastle's capture was strategically devastating. It cut off London's coal supply and gave Scotland control of northern England. Worse, by treaty terms, Charles had to pay the Scottish army's expenses while it occupied English territory. This was beyond humiliation. It was complete defeat. Charles had no choice now. In November 1640, he summoned Parliament again. This Parliament, which would sit intermittently for the next 20 years through wars, regicide, and republic, became known as the Long Parliament. Its members arrived in Westminster determined to ensure that no king could ever again rule without Parliament or threaten English liberties as Charles had done. Before they would grant Charles money to deal with the Scots, they intended to dismantle the apparatus of personal rule and impose constitutional limits on royal power. Led by John Pym, a brilliant parliamentarian and stern Puritan, the Commons moved aggressively. They arrested and impeached Charles's chief ministers. Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, the king's most effective and ruthless agent, was charged with treason. Strafford had governed Ireland with an iron hand, building an Irish army loyal to the king that some feared Charles might use against England. His trial became a sensation. When evidence for treason proved insufficient, Parliament passed a Bill of Attainder, a legislative act declaring him guilty without trial. Charles agonized over whether to sign it. Strafford had served him loyally. Signing the attainder meant betraying his servant to save himself. Under enormous pressure, facing threats that mobs might attack the palace, Charles signed. In May 1641, Strafford was executed on Tower Hill before a massive crowd. Charles would later describe signing the death warrant as his greatest regret. Archbishop Laud was also arrested and imprisoned in the Tower. Parliament abolished the prerogative courts, Star Chamber and High Commission, that Charles had used to prosecute opponents without juries. They passed the Triennial Act, requiring Parliament to be summoned at least every 3 years, whether the king willed it or not. They declared ship money illegal. Piece by piece, they dismantled the legal and institutional framework Charles had used to rule without them. Charles yielded to these demands, largely because he had no choice. His authority had never seemed weaker. He needed Parliament to deal with Scotland, and Parliament held all the leverage. But as 1641 progressed, divisions appeared within Parliament itself. While everyone agreed on limiting royal power and protecting traditional liberties, they disagreed about religion and how far reform should go. Moderates wanted to curb the king's worst excesses, but preserve the essential structure of church and monarchy. Radicals, especially Puritans, wanted deeper changes, abolishing bishops, purifying church worship, perhaps even restricting royal power permanently through a new constitution. In October 1641, news arrived from Ireland that transformed the situation. Catholics in Ireland, inspired by Scotland's successful defiance, and fearing that an ascendant Puritan Parliament might suppress Catholicism more harshly, rose in rebellion. Reports, often exaggerated or false, told of massacres of Protestant settlers, of Catholics slaughtering men, women, and children. Panic spread through England. An army would need to be raised immediately to suppress the Irish rising. But who would control that army? If it was commanded by the king, might Charles use it not against Irish rebels but against his English critics? If it was controlled by Parliament, would that not represent an unprecedented usurpation of royal prerogative? This question of who controlled the army became the breaking point. In November 1641, Parliament presented the Grand Remonstrance, a massive document listing every grievance against Charles's rule since 1625. It passed the Commons by only 11 votes, revealing how divided Parliament had become. Charles, sensing that opinion was turning against the radicals, decided to act. In January 1642, he attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament, including John Pym, on charges of treason. He came personally to the Commons chamber with armed guards, but the 5 members, warned in advance, had fled. Charles's invasion of Parliament shocked everyone. It was an unprecedented violation of parliamentary privilege, and it failed completely. Within days, Charles left London. He would not return until he came as a prisoner. Through spring and summer 1642, both sides prepared for war, though many still hoped to avoid it. Charles established his headquarters in Oxford and began raising an army from supporters in the north and west. Parliament, controlling London and the southeast, recruited its own forces. Nobles and gentry chose sides. Often with great reluctance, families divided, sometimes brother against brother. In August 1642, Charles raised his royal standard at Nottingham, the traditional signal that the king was calling his subjects to arms. Civil war had begun. The English Civil War did not begin with careful strategy or clear objectives. It began with confusion, improvisation, and an almost disbelieving sense that this was really happening, that Englishmen would actually fight Englishmen, that a kingdom would tear itself apart over questions of religion, royal authority, and constitutional rights that neither side could compromise on without betraying everything they believed. Both sides, in autumn 1642, were frantically trying to raise armies from populations with no experience of civil conflict. England had not fought a war on its own soil for generations. The soldiers who marched under the royal standard or Parliament's colors were mostly volunteers motivated by loyalty to king or cause, or conscripts pressed into service by local lords and officials. Few had military training. They carried whatever weapons could be found: pikes, muskets, swords, sometimes just farming tools. Officers were chosen based on social rank rather than experience. The whole enterprise seemed improvised and chaotic. The king's army, known as cavaliers from the French word for horsemen, drew support primarily from the north and west of England and Wales. These regions were more rural, more conservative, more attached to traditional hierarchies. Nobles and gentry who valued the old order, who believed in the divine right of kings and the beauty of church ceremony, rallied to Charles. The Cavaliers had strong cavalry, horsemen from wealthy families who could afford good mounts and equipment. They also had the advantage of unity. They fought for their king, a clear focus of loyalty. Parliament's army, called Roundheads because many Puritan soldiers cut their hair short, in contrast to the fashionable long locks of Cavalier gentry, controlled London, the southeast, and East Anglia. London's wealth provided crucial financial resources. The navy sided with Parliament, giving them control of ports and trade. Parliament's supporters included merchants, craftsmen, Puritan gentry, and those who believed traditional English liberties needed defending against royal tyranny. But Parliament's forces initially suffered from divided command. Multiple generals led separate armies, sometimes failing to coordinate, each protective of his authority and resources. The first major battle occurred on October 23, 1642, at Edgehill in Warwickshire. Charles was marching toward London with about 14,000 men when parliamentary forces under Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, intercepted him. Essex commanded roughly 15,000 soldiers. Neither commander had a clear plan. The battle developed almost accidentally when the two armies found themselves in proximity and decided they had to fight. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, Charles's nephew and cavalry commander, led the first charge. Rupert was young, fearless, and brilliant at cavalry tactics. His horsemen smashed through the parliamentary left wing, scattering them completely. Flushed with success, Rupert's cavalry pursued the fleeing soldiers off the battlefield entirely, chasing them for miles. This was exhilarating but tactically disastrous. It removed Rupert's force from the main battle just when they might have crushed Parliament's center. With Rupert gone, Parliament's infantry held firm. The center became a brutal push of pike and musket, men stabbing and shooting at close range, the air thick with gunpowder smoke and screams. Charles's infantry struggled to break through. On the parliamentary right, cavalry held their position rather than chasing off defeated opponents, a discipline that would later be crucial. As the afternoon faded toward evening, both armies were exhausted and bloodied. Casualties were roughly equal, perhaps 1,500 dead on each side, with thousands more wounded. Neither side had won decisively. Charles failed to break through to London, but Parliament failed to stop him entirely. As darkness fell, both armies held their positions, too tired to continue. The next day, neither renewed the fight. Essex withdrew toward London, and Charles turned toward Oxford, which became his headquarters for the war's duration. Edgehill established patterns that would define much of the early war. Cavalry charges could be devastating, but if cavalry pursued too far, they abandoned the infantry. Pike and musket combat in the center was brutal and indecisive. Neither army had enough discipline or training to force a complete victory. Battles ended in bloodshed and confusion, with both sides claiming victory and neither achieving decisive results. Through 1643, the war spread across England. There was no single front line, but rather a patchwork of local conflicts. Castles and fortified towns became strategic prizes, besieged and defended with determined desperation. In the southwest, Ralph Hopton led Royalist forces to victories in Cornwall and Devon. In the north, the Earl of Newcastle commanded for the king, controlling Yorkshire and threatening to march south. Parliament controlled East Anglia and the southeast, but struggled to make headway elsewhere. One parliamentary commander began to stand out during 1643. Oliver Cromwell, a country gentleman from Huntingdonshire, had raised a cavalry regiment in East Anglia. Cromwell was 43 years old when the war began, with no military experience, but he possessed natural leadership ability and understood something crucial about winning battles. Discipline mattered more than social rank. Cromwell recruited his cavalry carefully, choosing men not for their family connections but for their religious conviction and martial spirit. He famously said he would rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else. His troopers were mostly Puritans, men who believed they fought for God's cause against popery and tyranny. They prayed together, sang psalms, and maintained strict discipline. When they charged, they did so in organized squadrons rather than wild individual attacks. Crucially, Cromwell trained them not to pursue defeated enemies off the battlefield, but to reform and support the infantry or attack the enemy's exposed flanks. In small engagements across East Anglia and Lincolnshire during 1643, Cromwell's cavalry earned a reputation for effectiveness. At Gainsborough in July, though outnumbered, they defeated Royalist cavalry through discipline and coordinated charges. Cromwell was promoted to colonel and given command of a double regiment, a larger force that became the core of what would later be the New Model Army's cavalry. But overall, 1643 was frustrating for Parliament. Despite controlling England's wealthiest regions, they could not translate resources into decisive military advantage. Part of the problem was command structure. The Earl of Essex commanded one army, William Waller another, and various local forces operated semi-independently. They rarely coordinated effectively. When they did win victories, they failed to exploit them. The war was grinding into stalemate, exhausting both sides without clear resolution. Parliament made a crucial decision. They would seek Scottish help. In September 1643, Parliament negotiated the Solemn League and Covenant with Scotland. In exchange for Scottish military support, Parliament agreed to reform the English Church along Presbyterian lines, abolishing bishops and adopting Scots-style governance. This was a huge concession. Many in Parliament disliked bishops but were not Presbyterians. However, they needed Scotland's experienced army. In early 1644, a Scottish Covenanter army of over 20,000 men crossed into England, dramatically shifting the military balance. The war's decisive phase was beginning. With Scottish aid, Parliament could concentrate forces against the King's northern army. In Yorkshire, the Earl of Newcastle found himself besieged in York by combined parliamentary and Scottish forces. To relieve York, Prince Rupert marched north with reinforcements. On July 6, 1644, all these forces met on Marston Moor, near York, in what would be the war's largest battle. Marston Moor on that July evening in 1644 must have been an overwhelming sight. The Allied parliamentary and Scottish army numbered perhaps 28,000 men, the largest force yet assembled in the war. They stretched across farmland to the north of the moor, their positions strong, their banners snapping in the wind. Facing them, Prince Rupert commanded about 18,000 royalists, outnumbered but confident in the fighting spirit of their cavalry and the prince's tactical brilliance. Both armies formed up in the traditional way. Infantry pike blocks stood in the center, musketeers on their flanks, cavalry on the wings. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky. For hours, the armies simply stared at each other, both commanders perhaps reluctant to commit to battle, both aware that this engagement could determine the war's outcome in the north. Some soldiers sat down, ate whatever food they carried, cleaned their weapons. The tension was unbearable, waiting, always waiting, knowing that soon the order would come to advance, to close with the enemy, to kill or be killed. Prince Rupert apparently believed the battle would not happen that day. Evening was approaching. Armies rarely fought at night. He sent word that his men could stand down, could relax, and prepare to fight the next morning. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. At about 7 in the evening, the Allied army attacked. Lord Fairfax ordered the assault, and suddenly thousands of men surged forward. The Royalists, caught unprepared, scrambled to reform their lines. On the parliamentary right wing, Oliver Cromwell led his cavalry against Rupert's troopers. This was the moment Cromwell had trained for, the test of his discipline and tactics against the most celebrated Royalist cavalry commander. The two forces crashed together with tremendous violence, horses screaming, swords flashing, pistols firing at point-blank range. For long minutes the melee swirled, neither side gaining clear advantage. Cromwell himself was wounded, cut on the neck, possibly by a sword, or perhaps thrown from his horse. He withdrew briefly to have the wound bandaged, but Cromwell's troopers held formation. They didn't break and scatter. They fought as units, supporting each other, maintaining cohesion. Gradually, through sheer discipline and numbers, they pushed Rupert's cavalry back. The prince tried to rally his men, but the momentum had shifted. Cromwell's cavalry broke through, scattering the Royalist horse in disorder. Now came the crucial difference. Rather than pursuing the defeated cavalry off the battlefield as Rupert so often did, Cromwell's troopers reformed. They turned inward toward the Royalist infantry, now exposed and vulnerable. On the opposite wing, things went less well for Parliament. Sir Thomas Fairfax led cavalry on the left, but they ran into marshy ground and fierce resistance from Royalist cavalry under George Goring. Fairfax's wing was routed, his men fleeing in panic. Goring's cavalry, like Rupert's so often did, pursued them off the battlefield, leaving the center to fend for itself. The center dissolved into chaos. Scottish and English infantry pushed forward against Royalist pike blocks. Fighting was savage. The men jammed together in dense formations, stabbing with pikes, firing muskets at faces just feet away, the injured trampled underfoot. The Royalist infantry fought with desperate courage, holding their ground, inflicting heavy casualties. At several points, it seemed they might prevail, that the superior numbers of the Allied army might not overcome Royalist determination. But then Cromwell's cavalry arrived. Having defeated Rupert's wing and reformed, they now charged into the exposed flank of the Royalist infantry. Pike formations, deadly from the front, were helpless against cavalry attacking from the side. The Royalist center crumbled. Men threw down their weapons and fled. Newcastle's Whitecoats, an elite infantry regiment, refused to surrender, fighting to the death in a heroic last stand that earned respect even from enemies. Nearly all were killed. As darkness fell completely, making further organized combat impossible, the Royalist army was shattered. They had lost perhaps 4,000 dead and thousands more captured. Among the dead were many officers and gentlemen who had rallied to the king's cause. Parliamentary and Scottish losses were also heavy, probably 2,000 dead, but they had won decisively. York surrendered within weeks. The north of England was lost to the king. The Earl of Newcastle, his army destroyed, went into exile on the continent. Prince Rupert retreated toward the king's headquarters at Oxford. Marston Moor proved several crucial things. First, that disciplined cavalry, properly led and trained not to pursue defeated enemies rashly, could be decisive. Cromwell's performance earned him widespread recognition. He became known as Ironside after someone praised his troops as Ironsides who could not be broken. The name stuck, applied to Cromwell himself and later to his entire cavalry force. Second, the battle demonstrated that the war could be won. Until Marston Moor, victories had been inconclusive. Now Parliament had destroyed a major royalist army and captured an entire region. If this could be replicated elsewhere, the king could be defeated completely. Third, the Scottish alliance had proven its value, though it came with costs. Scottish forces had fought bravely at Marston Moor, but they expected Parliament to honor its religious promises, to establish Presbyterianism in England, to abolish bishops and impose uniformity of worship. This would create future tensions, as many in Parliament and especially in the army had no desire to replace Anglican bishops with Presbyterian assemblies, seeing both as threats to religious liberty. Yet despite Marston Moor's decisiveness in the north, the war ground on elsewhere. In the southwest, parliamentary armies suffered defeats. At Lostwithiel in Cornwall, the Earl of Essex's army was surrounded and forced to surrender, though Essex himself escaped by boat. In the South and Midlands, Royalist and parliamentary forces maneuvered and skirmished without decisive result. The war had been going on for over 2 years, costing enormous amounts of money, consuming lives, devastating whole regions where armies marched and foraged. Both sides were exhausted, but neither could find a way to end it short of complete victory. Parliament faced internal divisions about how to prosecute the war. Some generals, including the Earl of Manchester, who had commanded at Marston Moor, seemed reluctant to press for total victory. They were nobles who feared that defeating the king utterly might unleash social chaos, might threaten the established order of society. Better perhaps to force Charles to negotiate, to reach some settlement that preserved monarchy and social hierarchy while protecting Parliament's rights and preventing future tyranny. Cromwell and others disagreed vehemently. They had seen too much bloodshed, sacrificed too much, to settle for half measures. The king could not be trusted. He had violated every promise, shown contempt for Parliament and law. Only complete military victory could secure the changes they had fought for. Cromwell publicly criticized Manchester for not pursuing defeated royalists aggressively enough, for letting opportunities slip away. This debate about war aims and military strategy led to dramatic political changes. In late 1644 and early 1645, Parliament passed 2 revolutionary measures. The self-denying ordinance required all members of Parliament to resign military commands. This removed noble generals like Manchester and Essex, who held seats in the Lords. Theoretically, it also removed Cromwell, who sat to win Commons, though he was exempted through repeated temporary commissions. Second, Parliament created the new model army, a professional, centrally funded force that would replace the various regional armies and operate under unified command. This was revolutionary. England had never maintained a standing professional army in peacetime. Armies were raised for specific campaigns, then disbanded. Now Parliament was creating a permanent military force, trained, disciplined, and loyal not to individual generals but to Parliament itself. The new model army would transform the war. It would bring discipline, tactical innovation, and religious fervor together in a force unlike anything England had seen. And it would be commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax, with Oliver Cromwell as his lieutenant general of horse. Together, They would break the king's armies and bring the first phase of the Civil War to a decisive end. In the winter of 1645, while snow covered the English countryside and armies withdrew to winter quarters, Parliament assembled something unprecedented, a purpose-built military force designed not just to win battles, but to end the war decisively. The New Model Army, as it came to be called, represented a radical departure from traditional English military organization. It would prove to be one of the war's true game changers, perhaps the single most important factor in Parliament's eventual victory. The New Model Army's structure was carefully planned. It would comprise 22,000 soldiers, 11 regiments of cavalry totaling 6,600 horsemen, 12 regiments of infantry totaling 400-foot soldiers, and 1 regiment of 1,000 dragoons, mounted infantry who rode to battle but fought on foot. This was larger than any single army England had fielded before, and it would be maintained as a unified force under centralized command, rather than dispersed into regional forces, each protecting its own territory. Funding came from a new assessment tax levied across Parliament-controlled territories. For the first time, soldiers would be paid regularly and adequately, 10 pence per day for cavalry troopers, 8 pence for infantry. Regular pay transformed military service from an act of feudal obligation or desperate necessity into something closer to professional employment. Soldiers who knew they would be paid, clothed, and fed were more willing to maintain discipline, less likely to desert, and less inclined to plunder civilian populations to survive. Command fell to Sir Thomas Fairfax, appointed Captain General with authority over the entire army. Fairfax was relatively young, just 33, but he had proven himself a capable commander in the north. More importantly, he was not a member of Parliament, having inherited his title and seat in the Lords, which the self-denying ordinance forced him to resign. This made him politically acceptable to all factions, connected enough to be respectable, but not enmeshed in Parliament's feuds. Oliver Cromwell was appointed Lieutenant General of Horse, commanding the cavalry despite being an MP. Parliament kept extending his commission temporarily, officially exempting him from the self-denying ordinance because his cavalry skills were deemed indispensable. This legal fiction fooled no one, but it allowed Parliament to retain its best general, while still claiming to have purged political appointees from military command. Philip Skippon, a veteran professional soldier who had trained London's militia, became Major General of the Foot, commanding the infantry. Skippon provided expertise and steadiness. He was not flashy or brilliant, but he was thoroughly competent, experienced in pike and musket, tactics, and skilled at training raw recruits into effective soldiers. The New Model Army drew soldiers from various sources. Some came from the armies of Essex, Manchester, and Waller, which were being absorbed into the new force. These men had experience but were used to their old commanders and ways. Others were conscripts, pressed into service from Parliament-controlled counties. Still others volunteered, drawn by pay, adventure, or belief in the cause. The challenge was melding these disparate groups into a unified, disciplined force. One revolutionary aspect was promotion by merit. In traditional English armies, officers were gentlemen, appointed because of social rank and connections. A poor man, no matter how brave or skilled, could never become an officer. The New Model Army changed this. Fairfax and Cromwell promoted men who proved themselves in battle, regardless of birth. A farmer's son who showed courage and tactical intelligence could become a captain, even a colonel. This meritocratic principle attracted talented men who would have been excluded from leadership in any other army. Religion permeated the New Model Army. Many officers and soldiers were Puritans, men who saw the war as a religious struggle against popery and tyranny. They held prayer meetings, sang psalms before battles, and discussed theology with the same intensity others might discuss tactics. Cromwell encouraged this religiosity, believing that soldiers fighting for God's cause would fight more bravely and maintain better discipline than mercenaries fighting only for pay. But the army's religious character also included diversity unusual for the time. While most soldiers were Calvinist Protestants, they represented various sects and interpretations. Some were Presbyterians who wanted church governance by assemblies. Others were independents who believed each congregation should govern itself without bishops or assemblies. Still others held more radical views: Baptists who practiced adult baptism, Seekers who rejected all organized churches, even a few who questioned traditional doctrines about the Trinity or predestination. This diversity would later cause tensions, but initially, shared opposition to bishops and commitment to the parliamentary cause held them together. Training began immediately. Regiments drilled daily, learning to march in formation, to execute complex maneuvers, to coordinate pike and musket fire. Cavalry practiced charges and reforms, learning to fight as cohesive units rather than as individual horsemen. Officers studied tactics, poring over military manuals from European wars, trying to understand what made armies succeed or fail. The new model army adopted standardized uniforms, red coats for infantry, which would become iconic in British military history. Previously, soldiers wore whatever clothing they had or could scavenge. Standardized uniforms fostered unit identity and made it easier to distinguish friend from foe in battles, chaos. They also symbolized the army's professional character. This was not a rabble of pressed men in rags, but a proper military force. Discipline was strictly enforced. Soldiers who stole from civilians faced severe punishment: whipping, branding, sometimes death. Desertion meant execution. Drunkenness on duty earned the stocks. This strictness may seem harsh, but it served crucial purposes. It kept soldiers under control, preventing the pillaging and civilian abuse that made armies hated. It maintained combat effectiveness. Drunk or undisciplined soldiers could not fight well. And it reinforced the army's self-image as righteous warriors, not criminals in uniform. The new model army also implemented better logistics. Supplies, food, ammunition, clothing were systematically procured and distributed. The army established its own supply train, with wagons and drivers to transport materials. Medical care, though primitive by modern standards, was organized more systematically than before. Surgeons accompanied regiments. Field hospitals, such as they were, treated wounded soldiers. These measures improved morale and effectiveness. Soldiers who knew they would eat regularly and receive care if injured were more willing to risk battle. By spring 1645, the new model army was as ready as time allowed. It was not yet the formidable force it would become after more battle experience, but it was better organized, better trained, and more unified than any English army before it. When Fairfax led it into the field in April, Parliament had a real chance to end the war militarily, rather than through the inconclusive skirmishing and negotiation that had characterized the previous 3 years. The army's first test came quickly. King Charles, trying to relieve pressure on his headquarters at Oxford, attacked the parliamentary stronghold of Leicester and captured it after a brief siege. This was a bold move, perhaps even desperate, but it gave Charles momentum and threatened Parliament's position in the Midlands. Parliament ordered Fairfax to abandon his siege of Oxford and engage the King's field army directly. Fairfax marched north with the new model army, about 14,000 strong. He sent word to Cromwell, who was in the eastern counties recruiting cavalry, to join him with all possible speed. Cromwell arrived with 3,000 horsemen just before battle was joined. The two forces, the King's Army and the New Model Army, maneuvered through Northamptonshire in the early June, each trying to gain advantage, both aware that a decisive confrontation was imminent. On June 13th, 1645, scouts reported that the King's Army was near the village of Naseby. Fairfax positioned his forces on rising ground north of the village, a strong defensive position. Charles, after some hesitation and against advice from experienced officers who counseled retreat, decided to give battle. He believed his army, though outnumbered, could defeat this new parliamentary force that had never fought together before. His cavalry, led by the brilliant Prince Rupert, had won so many engagements. His infantry were veterans who had held their ground in previous battles. Surely they could triumph again. What Charles didn't fully appreciate was that the New Model Army was not just another parliamentary force. It was something new, disciplined, unified, motivated, and led by commanders who had learned from 3 years of mistakes. At Naseby, the New Model Army would prove its worth and effectively end the king's hope of military victory. Dawn broke over Naseby on June 14th, 1645, with mist clinging to the low hills and valleys of Northamptonshire. The landscape was gentle farmland, fields marked by hedgerows, open pastures where sheep grazed, a typical English countryside about to become a battlefield. Soldiers on both sides woke early, those who had slept at all. Many had spent the night preparing equipment, sharpening swords, checking muskets, praying to God for protection and victory. Now, as pale sunlight burned through the morning fog, they could see the enemy across the fields, thousands of men in formation, waiting. The New Model Army held strong ground on Naseby Ridge, a low rise that gave them advantage of height and clear view of approaching enemies. Sir Thomas Fairfax had positioned his forces carefully. In the center stood the infantry, 12 regiments of foot soldiers, pikemen with their long spears held upright like a forest of steel, musketeers on the flanks, ready to pour fire into approaching enemies. The pike blocks formed dense formations, men packed shoulder to shoulder, the front ranks bracing their weapons against the ground to receive cavalry charges, the rear ranks are ready to push forward and maintain pressure. On the right wing, Oliver Cromwell commanded the cavalry, about 3,500 horsemen formed into squadrons. These were his Ironsides, men he had trained himself, veterans of Marston Moor and smaller engagements, disciplined troops who knew their business. They sat on their horses quietly, checking reins and saddles, murmuring prayers, waiting for orders. Cromwell rode among them, speaking words of encouragement, reminding them they fought for God's cause against tyranny and popery. On the left wing, Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law and a capable officer in his own right, commanded another cavalry force of about 3,000 horse. Ireton was young, perhaps too eager to prove himself, but he had courage and intelligence. His task would be to hold his position against Prince Rupert's legendary cavalry, no easy assignment. In reserve behind the main line, Fairfax kept additional troops, some infantry and cavalry that could be deployed wherever needed during battle. This was prudent generalship, learned from battles where committed reserves made the difference between victory and defeat. Altogether, Fairfax commanded about 14,000 men, the largest force Parliament had concentrated in a single army. Across the fields, perhaps a mile distant, the King's Army formed its battle line. Charles had about 9,000 soldiers, fewer than Fairfax, but still a formidable force. The king himself was present, a rare occurrence. Though actual command fell to Prince Rupert and Lord Astley, experienced officers who had fought together through the war's campaigns. The Royalist infantry, about 5,000 strong, stood in the center, formed into 3 brigades, or tercias as they called them. These men had seen action before. They knew the brutal reality of pike and musket combat, and they had survived previous battles through courage and endurance. On the Royalist right wing, Prince Rupert commanded the cavalry, about 2,100 horse. Rupert was brilliant and reckless, a cavalry commander whose charges had broken enemy lines in numerous engagements. His men worshipped him, believed him invincible, and would follow him anywhere. On the opposite wing, Sir Marmaduke Langdale led the remaining Royalist cavalry, a smaller force that had marched from the north after Marston Moor's defeat, survivors who had seen their comrades die and their cause suffer but still fought on. For a time, the 2 armies simply stared at each other across the fields. Commanders studied positions, calculated advantages, debated whether to attack or wait to be attacked. Morning passed toward noon. The tension was unbearable for soldiers standing in formation, unable to sit or relax, knowing that soon, very soon, the killing would begin. Finally, around 10 in the morning, the Royalists advanced. King Charles had decided to attack, to seize initiative rather than defend. It was a bold choice, perhaps born of desperation or confidence that his cavalry could break the parliamentary wings and destroy Fairfax's army. Prince Rupert led his cavalry forward on the right, trotting at first, then cantering, finally charging at full gallop toward Ireton's wing of parliamentary cavalry. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves. Rupert's men lowered their swords, fired pistols at near point-blank range, and crashed into Ireton's cavalry with tremendous force. The impact was like waves breaking against rocks. Horses screamed and fell. Men were thrown from saddles or cut down by slashing blades. Ireton's cavalry tried to hold, but Rupert's charge was irresistible. The parliamentary left wing began to crumble, to break and scatter. Ireton himself fought bravely, too bravely perhaps. He was surrounded by Royalist cavalry, took a pike wound to the thigh, was slashed across the face by a sword, and was captured. His cavalry fled in panic, pursued by Rupert's horsemen who, intoxicated by victory, chased them off the battlefield entirely. It was Rupert's familiar pattern: brilliant charge, devastating success, but then pursuit that removed his force from the main battle just when they might have secured complete victory. In the center, the infantry clashed with savage intensity. Royalist foot soldiers advanced uphill against the New Model Army's pike blocks. The 2 formations met with a crash that could be heard across the battlefield. Pikes thrust forward, seeking flesh. Musketeers fired volleys into dense enemy ranks, the smoke creating a fog that obscured vision. The noise deafening. Men in the front ranks fought hand to hand, stabbing, shooting, using musket butts as clubs when they had no time to reload. The Royalist infantry fought magnificently. They pushed forward against numerical superiority, drove back the first parliamentary lines, inflicted heavy casualties. For a time, it seemed possible they might break through the center entirely, might achieve the impossible, and defeat the New Model Army in its first major battle. Parliamentary infantry fell back, step by step, contesting every foot of ground but unable to stop the Royalist advance. But on the right wing, events unfolded very differently. Cromwell led his Ironsides forward against Langdale's Royalist cavalry. Unlike Rupert's dramatic charge, Cromwell's advance was measured, controlled. His squadrons maintained formation, moving as cohesive units rather than as individual horsemen. When they struck Langdale's force, the impact was still violent, but Cromwell's cavalry fought as a disciplined whole. Langdale's men, outnumbered and tired from long marches, could not withstand Cromwell's assault. They broke, turned, and fled. But here was the crucial difference from Rupert's victory on the opposite wing. Cromwell did not pursue. He had drilled this into his men countless times. Do not chase defeated enemies off the battlefield. Reform, maintain cohesion, and exploit your victory where it matters most. His cavalry followed these orders. They drove off Langdale's force, then wheeled inward toward the exposed flank of the Royalist infantry. The Royalist foot soldiers, fighting desperately in the center, suddenly faced a new threat. Cromwell's cavalry charged into their flank and rear, positions where dense pike formations were vulnerable. Pikemen could present a forest of spears to the front, making cavalry charges suicidal, but they could not defend all directions simultaneously. Cavalry attacking from the side or behind could cut them down before they could turn to face the threat. Cromwell's Ironsides fell upon the Royalist infantry with devastating effect. They rode through the formations, sabering men who could not defend themselves, creating panic and disorder. The Royalist center began to collapse. Some units fought on with incredible bravery, refusing to yield even when surrounded. The king's own lifeguard infantry, his most loyal troops, stood their ground and died almost to a man rather than surrender. Fairfax, seeing the Royalist center crumbling, committed his reserves. Fresh parliamentary infantry advanced, adding their weight to the assault. The Royalist position became hopeless. Men threw down their weapons and tried to surrender. Others fled toward the baggage train in the rear, hoping to escape. Officers shouted orders that no one followed. The army that had marched confidently to battle just hours before was disintegrating into a panicked mob. King Charles, watching from a position behind his lines, wanted to lead his guard cavalry in a last desperate charge, to die fighting for his cause rather than retreat in defeat. Advisors physically restrained him, turned his horse, and led him away from the battlefield. His presence was necessary for the cause to continue. If he died or was captured at Naseby, the war ended immediately. Charles fled toward Leicester with his guard, bitter and humiliated but alive. Prince Rupert returned to the battlefield with his cavalry, having finally finished pursuing Ireton's fleeing troops. He found disaster. His infantry destroyed, his baggage train captured, parliamentary cavalry controlling the field. There was nothing he could do. His cavalry, tired from their long pursuit and their earlier charge, could not turn the battle now. Rupert gathered what troops he could and retreated, following the king toward Leicester. As the afternoon wore on, the magnitude of the Royalist defeat became clear. They had lost over 1,000 men killed in combat. Another 4,500 were captured, including most of the infantry who had fought so bravely in the center. All the artillery was taken. The baggage train was seized, and in it, parliamentary soldiers found Charles's personal correspondence, letters to his wife, and foreign contacts, revealing his plans to bring Irish and continental Catholic armies to England, to make concessions to Catholics in exchange for military support, to continue the war indefinitely rather than accept any compromise with Parliament. These letters proved politically devastating. Parliament published them as the King's cabinet opened, and they shocked many who had hoped Charles might negotiate in good faith. The letters showed he had been secretly undermining every peace negotiation, that he planned to use foreign Catholic armies against his own Protestant subjects, that he could not be trusted under any circumstances. Many moderate royalists, reading these revelations, lost faith in their king. Some changed sides. Others simply withdrew from the conflict, disillusioned and disgusted. Parliamentary losses at Naseby were relatively light. perhaps 150 killed and 300 wounded. The new model army had proven its worth spectacularly in its first major engagement. Discipline, training, and coordinated tactics had overcome royalist courage and experience. The battle demonstrated that Parliament could win, that the king's cause was not invincible, that this war could actually be brought to a conclusion through military force. In the weeks following Naseby, the royalist position collapsed across England. Towns and castles that had held for the king surrendered as news of the defeat spread. Leicester was recaptured within days. In the southwest, Fairfax marched with the new model army, systematically reducing royalist strongholds. Bristol, one of England's most important ports, and a royalist fortress for years, surrendered in September after a brief siege. The West Country fell quickly once the new model army arrived. By autumn 1645, the king controlled little beyond Oxford and a few isolated garrisons. Charles, his military options exhausted, tried to negotiate. He sent messages to Parliament proposing peace talks, offering concessions. But Parliament, sensing complete victory within reach, saw no reason to compromise. They demanded Charles disband his remaining forces, abandon Oxford, and accept Parliament's terms entirely. Charles refused. He still clung to hope that something might save him. Perhaps the Scots would intervene. Perhaps his enemies would fall out among themselves. Perhaps foreign powers would send assistance. None of these hopes materialized. By spring 1646, the war's end was obvious to everyone, except perhaps Charles himself. Oxford was besieged, the king's last significant stronghold surrounded and slowly starved into submission. Charles faced a choice: remain in Oxford and surrender to Parliament when the city inevitably fell, or leave and seek some other option. On April 27, 1646, Charles slipped out of Oxford in disguise, leaving the city to surrender without him. He rode north toward Scotland, hoping the Scots might offer protection. It was a desperate gamble. The Scots had fought for Parliament, had contributed to the king's defeat. But Charles calculated that Scottish pride and their historical connection to the Stuart dynasty might overcome their alliance with Parliament. He thought wrong. When Charles reached the Scottish army at Newark in early May 1646, they gave him refuge, but also made him a prisoner. They would not fight for him against Parliament, nor would they let him go free. Instead, they negotiated with Parliament about what to do with their unexpected captive. The First Civil War ended not with dramatic battles, but with slow collapse. Remaining royalist garrisons surrendered one by one through summer 1646. Prince Rupert, holding Bristol, had already yielded. The West Country submitted. Wales was pacified. By the end of 1646, no royalist armies remained in the field. The king was a prisoner. Parliament had won. But winning the war proved easier than deciding what to do with victory. For the next 2 years, England struggled with fundamental questions. What kind of government should they have? What religious settlement? What place, if any, for the king in a new constitutional order? These questions had no easy answers, and the attempts to answer them would lead to renewed conflict, ultimately to regicide and revolution that transformed England in ways no one had anticipated when the war began. The Scottish army that held King Charles in captivity faced an uncomfortable dilemma. They had the King of Scotland and England as their prisoner, but they had no clear plan for what to do with him. Charles, for his part, tried to exploit divisions between his captors, between Scots and English, between Parliament and its own army, between Presbyterians and other Protestant sects. He was a prisoner, but he still possessed something valuable: legitimacy. No settlement could be stable without addressing the question of monarchy. As long as Charles lived, he remained central to English politics even in defeat. For months, negotiations ground on between Charles, the Scots, and Parliament. Charles offered concessions. He would accept Presbyterian church governance in England for a trial period. He would agree to parliamentary control of the militia for 10 years. He would pardon everyone who had fought against him. But his concessions always came with conditions and escape clauses, and they never addressed the fundamental issue that Parliament insisted upon, that sovereignty ultimately rested not with the king alone, but with the king in Parliament, that Charles could not rule without parliamentary consent. Charles could not accept this principle. He believed utterly in his divine right, that God had appointed him king, that to surrender sovereignty to Parliament violated his sacred duty. He would negotiate tactics, how long a Presbyterian establishment, who controlled what offices, but never the underlying principle, and Parliament's negotiators, after years of war and broken promises, no longer trusted him. They suspected, rightly, that Charles agreed to things he had no intention of honoring, that he was buying time and hoping circumstances would change. By January 1647, the Scots tired of hosting the king and negotiating with Parliament. They wanted to go home, to receive payment for their military service, and to be rid of Charles. They negotiated a deal with Parliament. They would hand over the king and withdraw their army from England in exchange for $400,000, the back pay owed for their military service. On January 30th, 1647, the Scottish army marched north, leaving Charles in English custody. Parliament brought Charles to Holmby House in Northamptonshire, a comfortable residence where he was treated with respect, appropriate to his rank, but closely guarded. Parliament continued trying to negotiate a settlement, presenting Charles with proposals for his restoration under strict conditions. These propositions required Charles to accept Presbyterian church governance, grant Parliament control of the militia for 20 years, and agree to exclude from government all those who had advised him during the Civil War. Charles rejected these terms. He believed time was on his side. Already tensions were emerging between Parliament and its own army. The new model army that had won the war but now found itself sidelined in peace negotiations. The soldiers had not been paid regularly. Parliament discussed disbanding much of the army without full back pay, perhaps even without indemnity for actions taken during the war. This was a dangerous insult to men who had risked their lives and won the war, only to be dismissed like unwanted servants. The new model army began organizing politically, forming committees to press their grievances. Soldiers elected representatives called agitators from each regiment to speak for them. These agitators joined with senior officers to petition Parliament for their rights, full back pay, indemnity for wartime actions, pensions for war widows and disabled veterans, and, crucially, a voice in the political settlement. The army was not content to simply disband and let Parliament and the King decide England's future without them. This army politicization alarmed Parliament. Many MPs feared the army was becoming a dangerous force, radical in religion and politics, a threat to order and property. In June 1647, Cornet Joyce, a junior cavalry officer, rode to Holmby House with 500 troopers and, without orders from senior commanders, seized custody of the king. Joyce removed Charles to army headquarters, effectively making Charles the army's prisoner rather than Parliament's. Senior army officers, including Fairfax and Cromwell, found themselves in an awkward position. They had not ordered Joyce's action, but they could not repudiate it without losing control of their own army. Instead, they accepted custody of Charles and began their own negotiations with him, separate from Parliament's efforts. The army proposed its own settlement, the heads of proposals, which was notably more generous to Charles than Parliament's terms. The army would accept bishops in the church alongside other forms of worship, would restore Charles to full monarchical powers after guarantees for English liberties, and would grant religious toleration to Protestant sects. Charles seemed interested in the army's proposals, but did not commit. He played army against Parliament, Parliament against Scots, everyone against everyone else, always seeking advantage, never accepting any settlement that limited his power permanently. His intransigence frustrated even those who wanted to restore him. Oliver Cromwell, who had tried to find a settlement that preserved monarchy while securing the Revolution's gains, began to believe Charles was dealing in bad faith, that the king would never accept any genuine limitation on his authority. In November 1647, Charles made a dramatic escape. From Hampton Court Palace, where he was being held in comfortable but guarded conditions, he fled across the Thames and rode south toward the coast. His destination was unclear. Perhaps he meant to flee to France or Holland, to join his wife and children in exile and plot restoration from abroad. But Charles only reached the Isle of Wight, where he surrendered to Robert Hammond, the parliamentary governor of Carisbrooke Castle, hoping Hammond might help him escape to the continent. Hammond, loyal to Parliament, made Charles his prisoner at Carisbrooke. Charles now found himself more strictly confined than before, though still treated with respect. From Carisbrooke, Charles conducted secret negotiations with Scottish commissioners. Scots who had fought against him before now agreed to invade England on his behalf, to restore him to power. In exchange, Charles promised to establish Presbyterian church governance in England for 3 years and support the Scottish Kirk. This secret treaty, called the Engagement, was Charles's most cynical betrayal. He had promised Parliament he would negotiate in good faith. He had suggested to the army he might accept their proposals. Meanwhile, he was making deals with Scots to invade England and restore him by force. When the engagement became known, it destroyed any remaining trust in Charles. Even those who had advocated monarchy and negotiated settlement began to conclude the king could not be trusted, that any peace made with him would be temporary, that Charles would always seek to overturn any restrictions on his power. In spring 1648, the feared Scottish invasion began. A Covenanter army crossed into England, aiming to march south and restore Charles. Simultaneously, royalist uprisings erupted across England and Wales, in Kent, Essex, Cornwall, South Wales. These were not coordinated carefully enough to succeed, but they threatened to reignite the Civil War. Parliament called on the new model army, which had been kept in being despite Parliament's earlier desire to disband it, to suppress these risings. The army responded efficiently and brutally. Fairfax besieged and captured Colchester after a long and bitter siege, where royalist commanders were executed afterward for treason. In Wales, Cromwell captured Pembroke Castle and pacified the region. Then Cromwell marched north to face the Scottish invading army, which had advanced into Lancashire under the Duke of Hamilton. At Preston in August 1648, Cromwell caught the Scottish army strung out along the road, unprepared for battle. In a series of engagements over 3 days, Cromwell's smaller but more disciplined force destroyed Hamilton's army. It was a masterpiece of military execution, quick marches, decisive attacks, relentless pursuit. The Scottish invasion collapsed. Hamilton was captured and later executed. The Second Civil War ended almost as quickly as it had begun. But this Second War had profound political consequences. The army's patience with Charles was exhausted. Soldiers who had fought and bled, who had seen comrades die in the First War, had been forced to fight again because Charles had betrayed negotiations and invited Scottish invasion. They called him that man of blood, a biblical reference to King David, suggesting Charles bore personal guilt for every death in both wars. Many soldiers now believed Charles must be held accountable, that monarchy itself might need to be abolished if kings would always seek absolute power. Parliament remained divided. Many MPs still wanted to negotiate with Charles to reach some settlement that preserved monarchy. These moderates controlled Parliament's majority, but the army, increasingly radical, would not accept any restoration of Charles after his betrayals. The split between Parliament's moderate majority and the army's radical faction came to a head in December 1648. On December 6, 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride, acting on orders from senior army officers, stationed soldiers at the entrance to the House of Commons. As MPs arrived, Pride's soldiers arrested about 45 members known to favor continued negotiations with Charles and barred another 146 from entering. This became known as Pride's Purge. What remained after the Purge was a rump parliament of perhaps 75 to 80 members, those who supported the army's position that Charles must be brought to trial. The rump parliament quickly passed an ordinance creating a high court of justice to try the king for treason. It was an unprecedented act. No legal precedent existed for trying a reigning monarch. Kings had been deposed before, murdered in palace coups, killed in battle, but never publicly tried by their subjects. The very concept violated centuries of legal tradition. But the army insisted, and the rump parliament complied. Charles would stand trial for making war against Parliament and his own people, for betraying English liberties, for causing the deaths of thousands in pursuit of tyrannical power. King Charles was brought from the Isle of Wight to London in January 1649. He knew what awaited him. The trial would not be fair by any normal standard. The outcome was predetermined, the court's legitimacy questionable. But Charles saw an opportunity. He could refuse to recognize the court's authority, could maintain dignity, could present himself as a martyr for kingship and law against illegal revolutionary violence. If he had to die, he would die in a way that made his executioners look like villains, and himself a victim of mob justice. The trial of Charles III would indeed become one of history's most dramatic moments. A king standing before subjects who claimed authority to judge him. A clash of principles about sovereignty, law, and power that resonates through centuries. Charles's performance at his trial and his conduct at his execution would shape how history remembered him and influence debates about monarchy and democracy for generations to come. Westminster Hall, the vast medieval chamber where English kings had held courts and parliaments for centuries, was transformed in January 1649 into a courtroom unlike any the world had ever seen. Carpenters erected galleries for spectators, a raised platform for judges, and a separate enclosure where the prisoner would stand. The prisoner in question was no common criminal, but Charles Stuart, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, who would be tried not for ordinary crimes, but for treason against his own people. The High Court of Justice consisted of 135 commissioners, though only about 67 would actually attend the trial. These were not professional judges, but military officers, parliamentarians, and gentry who supported the army's radical position. John Bradshaw, a lawyer and Republican, was chosen to preside. He wore a bulletproof hat during the proceedings, reportedly fearing assassination attempts by Royalist sympathizers. The prosecutors included John Cook, a skilled lawyer who would argue the unprecedented case that a king could be charged with high treason against the people he ruled. On Saturday, January 20th, 1649, Charles was brought to Westminster Hall through crowds of people who had gathered to witness this extraordinary event. He walked calmly, dressed in black with his blue garter ribbon, the symbol of his knighthood in England's most prestigious order. At age 48, Charles showed the stress of years of war and captivity. His hair and beard were graying, his face lined. But he carried himself with dignity. He would not allow his captors to see him broken or afraid. When Bradshaw called the court to order, a clerk read the charge against Charles. The king was accused of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation. Specifically, the charge stated that Charles had levied war against Parliament and the people, that he had sought to establish tyrannical power, that he was responsible for the bloodshed and suffering of the civil wars. It was a political manifesto as much as a legal indictment, accusing the king not of specific acts, but of attempting to subvert the constitution and liberties of England. Charles refused to acknowledge the court's authority. When Bradshaw asked how he pleaded to the charges, Charles replied that he did not recognize any court's power to try a king. "I would know by what power I am called hither," Charles said. "Remember, I am your king, your lawful king, and what sins you bring upon your heads, and the judgment of God upon this land. Think well upon it, I say, think well upon it, before you go further from one sin to a greater." Bradshaw responded that Charles was brought before the court in the name of the people of England, of which you are elected king. This was the Revolution's fundamental claim, that sovereignty resided in the people, that kings ruled by consent rather than divine right, that when a king betrayed his trust, he could be held accountable. Charles rejected this entirely. England was never an elective kingdom, but an hereditary kingdom for near these 1,000 years. He declared, he stood on the ancient principle that kings answered only to God, not to earthly powers. For 3 days, the trial followed this pattern. Prosecutors presented evidence of Charles's war-making against Parliament. Witnesses testified to seeing the king's standard raised at Nottingham, to battles where royal armies fought parliamentary forces. The evidence was overwhelming and undisputed. Charles had made war against Parliament. But Charles refused to plead, refused to participate in the proceedings beyond denying the court's jurisdiction. His arguments had force. By what law was this court established? Parliament had passed an ordinance, but ordinances required the king's assent to become law. The House of Lords had refused to approve the trial. Most of the Commons had been excluded by force in Pride's Purge. This court represented a tiny faction, backed by military power, claiming to act in the people's name, but with no electoral mandate. Charles pointed out these contradictions, arguing that he stood for law and ancient rights, while his accusers represented military tyranny dressed in legal language. But the court would not be swayed by legal arguments. This was ultimately a political trial. The army had decided Charles must die, and the Rump Parliament would provide legal cover for that decision. Bradshaw made clear that the court derived its authority from the Commons, which represented the people, and the people's representatives could indeed judge a king who had betrayed them. On the third day, Bradshaw offered Charles one final opportunity to answer the charges. Charles again refused. He would not legitimize the proceedings by entering a plea. Bradshaw declared that the court would proceed without Charles's participation. The following day, Saturday, January 27th, the court reconvened to deliver judgment. Only the judges were present, not Charles. They debated briefly, then voted unanimously to convict. Bradshaw pronounced the sentence, "For all which treasons and crimes this court doth adjudge, that he, the said Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body." 59 commissioners signed the death warrant. Their signatures sealed Charles's fate and marked them as regicides, king-killers, a label that would haunt them when monarchy was eventually restored. Among the signers were Cromwell, Ireton, Pride, and other army officers, along with Republican politicians who believed England could be a Commonwealth without kings. Charles was allowed one final public appearance in Westminster Hall on January 27th, after the sentence had been pronounced. He asked to speak. Bradshaw at first refused, saying the sentence had been passed, but Charles persisted, and Bradshaw finally allowed him a few words. Charles said he was not allowed to speak in his own defense during the trial, silenced when he tried to argue the law. He warned that the liberty of the people depended on law and tradition, that this court's arbitrary proceedings threatened everyone's rights. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things, Charles said, maintaining to the end his belief in monarchy's divine foundation. His final words were prophetic and moving. "I am not suffered for to speak. Expect what justice other people will have." He understood that if a court could be created by force to convict a king without due process, then no one's rights were safe. His executioners might claim to act for liberty, but Charles argued they were establishing tyranny of a new kind, rule by military power and revolutionary violence, rather than law and custom. Charles was taken to St. James's Palace to await execution. He had 3 days to prepare himself for death, to put his affairs in order and make peace with God. He spent them in prayer, in visits from his remaining loyal chaplains, and in saying goodbye to his 2 youngest children who remained in England. His wife, Henrietta Maria, and his 2 oldest sons, Charles and James, were in exile on the continent, safe from the revolution but unable to see him in his final days. The farewell to his children was heartbreaking. Elizabeth was 13, Henry 8. Charles held Elizabeth while he spoke, trying to comfort her, though she wept uncontrollably. He told her not to grieve too much, that he died for good causes, for the laws, liberties, and religion of England. He gave her messages to convey to her mother and siblings. To young Henry, Charles spoke sternly, making the boy promise never to accept the crown while his older brothers lived, warning that Parliament's intention was to make Henry king in name only, a puppet they could control. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, Charles woke early. It was bitterly cold, frost covering the ground, the Thames partially frozen. Charles dressed carefully. He wore 2 shirts, not wanting to shiver from cold and have observers think he trembled from fear. He took communion with Bishop William Juxon, the only Anglican bishop allowed to attend him. Then, surrounded by guards, he walked from St. James's Palace across the frozen park to Whitehall Palace, where the execution would take place. The scaffold was built outside the banqueting house at Whitehall, that magnificent hall where Charles had once hosted masques and celebrations, where Rubens's ceiling paintings glorified his father's reign and the divine right of kings. Now Charles would step through a window onto a platform draped in black to face execution before a crowd of thousands held back by soldiers so they could not interfere or even hear clearly the king's final words. Charles arrived at about 2 in the afternoon. The delay in timing had been caused partly by Parliament rushing through a bill making it illegal to proclaim his son as Charles II immediately upon his death. They wanted no question that monarchy was abolished, not merely transferred. Charles waited patiently at Whitehall, praying with Bishop Juxon, maintaining the composure he had shown throughout his ordeal. When finally led to the scaffold, Charles faced his executioners, 2 men heavily disguised with wigs, false beards, and masks to hide their identities. To this day, no one knows for certain who they were. Many executioners had refused the task, horrified at the thought of killing a king. These two accepted, whether from conviction, payment, or coercion, history does not record. On the scaffold were also Colonel Hacker, who commanded the guards, several other officers, and Bishop Jukesen. A small crowd of officials and soldiers stood nearby on the scaffold itself, close enough to hear the king's final words. But the larger crowd of thousands, held behind barriers and guarded by cavalry, would hear nothing. Charles spoke to those on the scaffold, knowing his words would be recorded and published. His speech was carefully composed, a final statement of his beliefs and his cause. He spoke calmly and clearly despite the cold and the circumstances. First, he addressed the charge that he had begun the war. "I must tell you," he said, "that the Parliament began upon me. It is the militia they began upon." He insisted he had not raised arms first, that Parliament's attempt to seize control of the militia had forced him to defend his prerogative. He spoke of the trial, saying he had been denied a proper defense. He explained his refusal to recognize the court's authority as a defense of law itself. He maintained that subjects and sovereigns were fundamentally different things, that monarchy was ordained by God, that Parliament's claim to sovereignty on behalf of the people was a dangerous fiction. Yet Charles also spoke with surprising nuance about liberty. "I must tell you that liberty and freedom consists in having of government," he said. "It is not for having share in government. That is nothing pertaining to them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things." He believed liberty meant living under just laws and stable government, not that common people should participate in ruling. It was an aristocratic understanding of freedom, but sincerely held. He spoke of religion, professing his commitment to Protestant Christianity, while defending the Anglican form with its bishops and ceremonies. He denied being a Catholic or harboring Catholic sympathies, responding to accusations that had plagued his reign. He forgave his enemies, as Christian doctrine required, though he maintained they were terribly wrong in what they were doing. Finally, Charles prepared himself. He took off his cloak and the George, the jeweled pendant of the Order of the Garter, handing them to Bishop Jukesen with the single word, "Remember," a mysterious instruction that has been debated by historians ever since. He put a white silk cap over his long hair, tucking the strands carefully so his neck would be clear for the axe. He asked the executioner if his hair was properly arranged. The executioner confirmed it was. Charles lay down, stretching his neck on the low block. He spread his arms as a signal when he was ready. For a moment he lay there, perhaps praying silently, perhaps gathering his courage, thinking of his wife and children, his crown lost, his life ending. Then he stretched forth his hands. The executioner raised the axe and brought it down in a single stroke. King Charles. Baron was dead. The crowd's reaction was complex. Some groaned or cried out in horror and grief. Others stood silent, stunned by what they had witnessed. Some may have felt satisfaction that the man they blamed for years of war had finally been held accountable. A troop of cavalry charged the crowd immediately after the execution, dispersing them before any organized response could form. Charles's head was held up briefly by one of the executioners, displayed to the crowd. Then his body was carried away, prepared for burial. Parliament authorized a private funeral at Windsor Castle in St. George's Chapel. On February 7th, in a simple ceremony with only a few attendants, Charles was laid to rest in the same vault that held Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. There was no elaborate funeral, no public mourning, no monument. The Commonwealth wanted Charles forgotten, the monarchy abolished as if it had never been. But Charles would not be forgotten. His execution shocked Europe. Monarchs across the continent saw the English regicide as a terrifying precedent. If subjects could try and execute their king, what safety did any monarch have? The French court was reportedly horrified. Charles's widow Henrietta Maria was sister to the French king Louis XIV. The Dutch, though Protestant and Republican in sympathy, found the execution barbaric. The Spanish court, though longtime enemies of England, expressed disgust at this violation of divine order. Within England, reactions were mixed. Royalists, though defeated and silenced by fear, mourned their king. Many believed Charles had been murdered, that the trial was a mockery, that his execution was judicial murder by military tyranny. They began to collect and circulate stories of Charles's piety and dignity in his final days, painting him as a martyr who died defending ancient rights and true religion against revolutionary chaos. Parliamentarians and army supporters justified the execution as necessary justice. Charles had made war on his people, had betrayed negotiations, had caused thousands of deaths through his stubborn refusal to accept constitutional limits. They argued that no man, not even a king, could be above the law, that the execution demonstrated that tyranny would not be tolerated, that England was now a commonwealth where authority came from the people, not from divine right or inherited privilege. One immediate result of Charles's execution was the abolition of monarchy itself. On February the 6th, the Rump Parliament passed an act making it treason to proclaim anyone king of England. On February 7th, the House of Lords was abolished as unnecessary and dangerous. On March 19th, the Commonwealth of England was formally proclaimed. England would be a republic, governed by Parliament and a Council of State, without king or hereditary House of Lords. It was a revolutionary transformation that seemed unthinkable just a decade earlier, when Charles still ruled without Parliament, during the personal rule. But the revolution faced enormous challenges. Most English people were not Republicans by conviction. They had fought for what they saw as their traditional rights and liberties, not to abolish monarchy. Now they found themselves in a commonwealth they had never asked for, ruled by a rump parliament that represented a tiny fraction of the political nation, backed by an army that many feared was becoming a dictatorship of its own. Scotland and Ireland rejected the Commonwealth immediately. Scotland proclaimed Charles's eldest son as King Charles the Sixth. Irish Catholics and Protestants, divided on everything else, united in refusing to accept the English Republic. The Commonwealth would have to conquer both kingdoms to impose its authority. This meant more years of war, more bloodshed, more division, and looming over everything was a question no one could fully answer. What kind of government could provide stability when traditional sources of legitimacy had been swept away? Parliament claimed to represent the people, but this Parliament had been purged by force, excluded most MPs, and abolished the House of Lords. The army claimed to fight for liberty, but it had used military power to override elected representatives and impose its will. Without monarchy, without the familiar hierarchies and traditions, what would hold society together? The Commonwealth would struggle with these questions for a decade before finally collapsing and inviting the monarchy to return. But first, it had to survive, to establish itself, to prove that England could exist without kings. In the cold February days following Charles I's execution, England found itself in uncharted waters. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the realm had no king. The ancient throne stood empty. The crown jewels lay locked away, symbols of a monarchy that Parliament had declared abolished forever. In their place, a Council of State governed, 41 men elected by the Rump Parliament to manage day-to-day administration. England was now officially the Commonwealth of England, a republic that existed almost by accident, created not through careful planning, but through the revolutionary momentum that followed regicide. The Commonwealth's leaders faced staggering challenges. They needed to establish legitimacy for a government most English people had never wanted. They had to suppress opposition from royalists, who saw Charles II, the executed king's eldest son, as the rightful monarch. They needed to conquer Scotland and Ireland, which rejected the Commonwealth's authority. They had to manage an expensive army that could not be disbanded without risking royalist resurgence, but could barely be afforded. And they had to do all this while maintaining some appearance of consent and legality, though the government itself had been born from military purge and regicide. The Rump Parliament, that remnant of the Long Parliament left after Pride's purge, provided whatever legitimacy the Commonwealth possessed. But this was a thin claim. The Rump contained perhaps 80 members, a fraction of the House of Commons' normal size. The House of Lords had been abolished entirely. Most of the country's traditional governing class, nobility and gentry, either opposed the Commonwealth openly or withdrew from politics, unwilling to collaborate with a regime they considered illegitimate. Power actually resided with the new model army. It was the army that had purged Parliament, forced the king's trial, and now guaranteed the Commonwealth's existence against internal and external enemies. But army rule raised troubling questions. England had fought a civil war partly to resist what it saw as arbitrary royal power. Now the army, unelected and self-appointed, exercised power that seemed equally arbitrary. The revolution risked becoming a military dictatorship, though its leaders insisted they fought for liberty and law. Oliver Cromwell stood at the intersection of military and political power. He was both an MP in the Rump Parliament and the army's most successful general. His military reputation made him indispensable. His political skills, though often rough and impulsive, made him the Commonwealth's most effective leader. But Cromwell himself struggled with deep ambivalence. He had not wanted to execute the king. He had tried to find a settlement that preserved monarchy in limited form. He believed in Parliament and law, yet he had supported Pride's purge and the king's trial when he concluded no other path remained. Now he found himself helping to govern a republic he had never intended to create. Religious radicals flourished in this revolutionary atmosphere. The old religious establishment, the Church of England with its bishops and set liturgy, had collapsed. In its place, a chaotic diversity emerged. Presbyterian assemblies tried to impose their system in some regions. Independent congregations, owing allegiance to no higher authority, multiplied rapidly. Baptists, who practiced adult baptism and rejected infant christening, established churches openly. Quakers, who believed in direct divine illumination and rejected formal ministry, attracted followers despite persecution. Even more radical groups appeared. Ranters who supposedly rejected all moral law. Diggers who argued for common ownership of land. Fifth monarchists who believed Christ's return was imminent and earthly governments should prepare for his kingdom. This religious explosion alarmed moderate Puritans and terrified conservatives. They had wanted a purified Protestant church, not this bewildering marketplace of sects and opinions. Many feared that without religious uniformity enforced by authority, society would descend into chaos. Cromwell, however, believed in toleration for most Protestant groups. He thought diversity in worship was acceptable as long as people agreed on core Christian doctrines and supported the Commonwealth. Only Catholics and those who denied fundamental Christian beliefs should be suppressed, in his view. But the Commonwealth could not focus primarily on domestic religious and political questions. Two kingdoms rejected its authority and had to be conquered. Ireland came first. The Irish Rebellion of 1641 had never been fully suppressed. By 1649, most of Ireland was controlled, either by Confederate Catholics, who had formed their own government based in Kilkenny, or by Royalists loyal to Charles II. Only Dublin and a few other garrisons remained under Parliament's control, besieged and desperate. In August 1649, Oliver Cromwell landed in Ireland with an army of 12,000 men. His mission was to reconquer Ireland for the Commonwealth, to punish those responsible for the 1641 uprising and alleged massacres of Protestant settlers, and to establish English Protestant control. Cromwell approached this task with religious fervor and military ruthlessness. He saw Irish Catholics as enemies of both England and true religion, rebels who deserved severe punishment. His first target was Drogheda, a coastal town north of Dublin, held by a royalist garrison. Cromwell besieged it, bringing up artillery to batter the walls. After several days of bombardment, breaches were opened, and Cromwell ordered an assault. His troops stormed through the breaches in fierce fighting. The garrison resisted fiercely, making the attackers pay for every street and building. When organized resistance finally collapsed, Cromwell gave an order that would haunt his reputation forever. He refused quarter to the defenders. By the rules of siege warfare as understood in that era, a garrison that refused surrender before walls were breached could be put to the sword if the city was taken by storm. This brutal custom was meant to encourage garrisons to surrender rather than force attackers to suffer heavy casualties in assault. But the scale of killing at Drogheda was extreme, even by 17th century standards. Perhaps 3,500 people were killed, including garrison soldiers, Catholic clergy, and possibly some civilians who had taken refuge in churches. Cromwell justified this as righteous judgment on rebels and papists, claiming it would shorten the war by terrifying other garrisons into surrender. A month later, Cromwell besieged Wexford in the southeast. Again, his artillery breached the walls. This time, negotiations for surrender were underway when some of Cromwell's troops broke discipline, rushed through the breaches before orders were given, and began a general slaughter. Perhaps 2,000 died before Cromwell could restore order. Whether this was deliberate policy or loss of control is debated, but the result was another massacre that spread terror through Catholic Ireland. These sieges achieved Cromwell's immediate goal. Other towns surrendered quickly when his army approached, unwilling to risk similar treatment. But they also created lasting bitterness. In Irish Catholic memory, Cromwell became a symbol of English Protestant oppression, his name a curse. The massacres at Drogheda and Wexford would be remembered and resented for centuries, feeding cycles of violence and revenge that poisoned Irish-English relations. Cromwell spent 9 months in Ireland, taking town after town, pacifying regions, establishing garrisons. By May 1650, when he was recalled to deal with threats in Scotland, most of Ireland was under Commonwealth control. The remaining Confederate and Royalist forces were besieged in a few western strongholds, where they would hold out for several more years but could not threaten the Commonwealth's position. The Irish campaign was militarily successful, but morally stained. A dark chapter in Cromwell's career that revealed the brutality of religious war and conquest. Scotland presented a different challenge. The Scots were not Catholic rebels, but Protestants, who had fought alongside Parliament during the Civil War. But they rejected the Commonwealth and had proclaimed Charles VI their king. This created an awkward situation. The Commonwealth could not tolerate an independent Scotland with a Stuart king who might invade England, but invading Scotland meant attacking former allies, fellow Protestants, who had helped win the Civil War. Charles II, meanwhile, was in Scotland trying to build an army. He was 20 years old, cynical beyond his years after a childhood spent in civil war and exile. Charles had no deep religious convictions. He would later convert to Catholicism on his deathbed. But in 1650, he signed the Scottish Covenant and pretended Presbyterian faith to gain Scottish support. The Scots distrusted him, knowing he made promises cynically, but they needed a king, and he needed an army. It was a marriage of convenience that satisfied neither party. In July 1650, Cromwell led an army of 16,000 men across the Scottish border. He expected to win quickly through superior discipline and experience. Instead, he encountered unexpected resistance. David Leslie, commanding the Scottish army, refused to give battle in the open, where Cromwell's veterans would have advantage. Instead, Leslie positioned his army in strong defensive positions, blocked roads, and denied Cromwell's army supplies. It was a patient, defensive strategy that frustrated Cromwell's attempts to force a decisive battle. By late August, Cromwell's situation was desperate. His army was starving, diseased, unable to advance or retreat safely. Leslie's Scots held all the strong positions. Cromwell pulled back toward Dunbar on the coast, hoping to evacuate by sea if necessary. Leslie followed, sensing victory, positioning his army on Doon Hill, overlooking Dunbar. He had Cromwell trapped. The Scottish army outnumbered the English significantly, perhaps 23,000 Scots against 11,000 English. Victory seemed certain, but Leslie made a fatal mistake. Pressured by Scottish clergy in his army, who believed God would grant victory if they attacked, Leslie moved his army down from the heights to cut off Cromwell's escape route. This abandoned the strong defensive position and brought the Scots onto ground where Cromwell could attack them. On the night of September 2nd, Cromwell saw the opportunity. His scouts reported the Scottish right wing was vulnerable, poorly positioned, with ground that would hamper their pike formations. At dawn on September 3rd, Cromwell attacked. His cavalry, supported by infantry, struck the Scottish right wing with devastating force. The surprise was complete. The Scots, expecting to be on the offensive, found themselves suddenly fighting for survival. Their right wing collapsed in confusion. Cromwell's cavalry swept through and turned inward, attacking the Scottish centre and left from the flank and rear. Within hours, the Scottish army was destroyed. Perhaps 3,000 Scots were killed and 10,000 captured. Cromwell's losses were minimal, perhaps 20 dead and a few dozen wounded. The Battle of Dunbar was Cromwell's masterpiece, a victory against overwhelming odds through patience, tactical insight, and brilliant execution. But it did not end the Scottish War. Leslie rallied survivors and raised new forces. Charles II was crowned King of Scotland at Scone on January 1st, 1651. The war continued through 1651 as Cromwell methodically captured Scottish towns and fortresses. In summer 1651, Charles and Leslie made a desperate gamble. They led their army south into England, hoping English royalists would rise to support their king. It was a forlorn hope. Cromwell let them advance, gathering forces to trap them. At Worcester on September 3rd, 1651, exactly 1 year after Dunbar, Cromwell's army met Charles's Scottish royalist force. The battle was fierce, lasting all day, but Cromwell's superiority in numbers and experience told. The royalist army was destroyed. Charles II barely escaped, fleeing through the countryside disguised as a servant, hiding in the famous oak tree at Boscobel, enduring adventures that became legendary. Eventually, he reached the coast and sailed to France to resume years of impoverished exile. Worcester was the final major battle of the Civil Wars. With Scotland conquered and Charles in exile, no significant military threat remained. The Commonwealth had won, but victory brought its own problems. The army was enormous, expensive, and politically powerful. It could not be disbanded without risking royalist resurgence, but paying for it required crushing taxation. The Rump Parliament, having served through years of war and revolution, was tired, conservative, more interested in protecting its own position than pursuing further reforms. Cromwell grew frustrated with the Rump. He and other army officers felt the Parliament was clinging to power without accomplishing anything. The Rump showed no interest in calling new elections, which might have provided fresh legitimacy. It passed laws to protect its members' property and privileges. It seemed to have become exactly what the Revolution had opposed, a self-interested oligarchy ruling for its own benefit rather than the people's good. Tensions built through 1652 and early 1653. The army presented Parliament with demands for reform, new elections, broader representation, laws protecting religious liberty. The Rump debated endlessly but did little. Finally, on April 20th, 1653, Cromwell's patience broke. He marched into Parliament with soldiers and forcibly dissolved the Rump. "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing," he reportedly told the MPs. "Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." It was another revolutionary act, another use of military force to override civilian government. Cromwell justified it as necessary to prevent Parliament from perpetuating itself indefinitely, to break political deadlock. But it revealed the fundamental instability at the heart of the Commonwealth. Without monarchy's traditional legitimacy, without broad consent, the government depended ultimately on force, and force was wielded by the army, which meant increasingly by Cromwell himself. After dissolving the Rump Parliament in April 1653, Oliver Cromwell faced a question that would define the next phase of the Revolution. What should replace it? England needed government, but every obvious option was problematic. The monarchy was abolished and Charles II in exile. The Long Parliament had been purged, then dissolved. Fresh elections might return a royalist majority, or conservatives hostile to the Revolution. Rule by the army would be naked military dictatorship. Cromwell, sincere in his belief that government should rest on consent and law, struggled to find a legitimate alternative. For several months, England was governed by a council of officers from the army, an arrangement that satisfied no one as anything but temporary. Cromwell consulted widely, seeking advice from independent ministers, army officers, and political theorists. Some suggested he simply take the crown himself, becoming King Oliver and re-establishing monarchy under a new dynasty. Cromwell rejected this. He had fought to end royal tyranny and would not become what he had opposed. Others proposed various republican models drawn from classical history or European examples. None seemed suited to English conditions. In July 1653, a novel experiment was tried. Cromwell and his council nominated an assembly of 140 men, selected for their religious zeal and commitment to reform. This assembly, called the Nominated Parliament, or derisively the Barebones Parliament, after one of its members named Praise God Barebone, consisted of godly men who would supposedly enact reforms to prepare England for Christ's coming kingdom. It was an attempt to create government based on religious virtue rather than social status or electoral mandate. The nominated Parliament quickly proved the gap between revolutionary idealism and practical governance. Radical, Members proposed abolishing tithes that supported ministers, reforming legal and financial systems, even questioning property rights. More conservative members, alarmed at this radicalism, worried the Parliament would overturn all social order. By December 1653, moderate members voted to dissolve themselves and return power to Cromwell, admitting the experiment had failed. This brought Cromwell to a reluctant acceptance. England needed stable government, and the only source of stability seemed to be himself. His military victories had given him prestige. His political position as the army's leader gave him power. If he would not take the crown, perhaps he could take executive authority in some other form that preserved republican principles while providing effective rule. In December 1653, senior officers drafted a constitution called the Instrument of Government. It created a new office, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The Lord Protector would serve as head of state and government, wielding executive power, commanding the army, conducting foreign policy. But his power would be limited by a Council of State and by Parliament, which must be called regularly. It was an attempt to create a balance, to avoid both royal tyranny and republican chaos by giving one man authority while surrounding him with checks. On December 16, 1653, Oliver Cromwell was installed as Lord Protector in a ceremony at Westminster Hall. He swore to govern according to the instrument of government, to uphold laws and liberties, to work with Parliament and Council. He wore plain black civilian dress. No crown, no royal regalia, deliberately republican in appearance. Yet the ceremony had monarchical elements. A sword of state carried before him, official oaths of allegiance, all the trappings of power, even if not the title of king. The Protectorate, as this new government was called, would last from 1653 until Cromwell's death in 1658. These 5 years saw England achieve a kind of stability after years of revolutionary turmoil. Cromwell proved an effective, if authoritarian, ruler. He maintained order, professionalized the government administration, pursued an aggressive foreign policy, and managed the delicate balance between different political and religious factions. But he never solved the fundamental problem of legitimacy. The Protectorate rested ultimately on military power and Cromwell's personal authority. What would happen when he died remained an unanswered question. Cromwell's religious policy as protector reflected his personal convictions. He believed in liberty of conscience for most Protestants, allowing Presbyterian, Independent, Baptist, and other Reformed churches to worship freely. He readmitted Jews to England after centuries of exile, seeing them as God's chosen people, whose conversion would precede Christ's return. He suppressed only those he deemed dangerous, Catholics, who he feared would aid Spanish or French intervention, and radical groups like Quakers who refused to take oaths or serve in the military. But even Cromwell's toleration had limits. When James Naylor, a prominent Quaker, rode into Bristol in 1656 in a manner that seemed to mimic Christ's entry into Jerusalem, with followers calling him Lord, Cromwell's Parliament arrested Naylor for blasphemy. Cromwell could not prevent Parliament from brutally punishing Naylor. He was flogged, branded, and had his tongue bored through with a hot iron, though Cromwell thought the sentence excessive. The incident revealed tensions between Cromwell's personal toleration and Parliament's desire for religious uniformity. Cromwell's parliaments were difficult relationships. The first Protectorate Parliament, elected in 1654, immediately questioned the instrument of government, debated the Protector's powers, and split into factions. Cromwell dissolved it in frustration after just 5 months. The Second Protectorate Parliament, elected in 1656, proved somewhat more cooperative, but still contentious. In 1657, this Parliament presented Cromwell with a new constitution, the Humble Petition and Advice, which invited him to take the title of king. The offer tempted Cromwell. Kingship would provide legitimacy, would restore familiar forms of government, would allow clearer succession to his son, but it would also betray everything the Revolution claimed to stand for. How could the man who had helped execute one king now take the crown himself? Army officers, especially Republicans who had fought to abolish monarchy, vehemently opposed the idea. After months of agonized deliberation, Cromwell refused the crown, but accepted modified terms of the humble petition that strengthened his powers while keeping the title of Protector. Foreign policy during the Protectorate was aggressive and successful. Cromwell launched naval war against Spain, capturing Jamaica in the Caribbean and establishing England's first significant West Indian colony. He allied with France against Spain, sending English troops to fight in Flanders. English ships harassed Spanish treasure fleets and colonies, reviving the privateering tradition of Elizabeth Thurston's reign. These policies were expensive, but they enhanced England's international prestige and established the beginnings of overseas empire. Domestically, the Protectorate brought a mixture of reform and repression. Cromwell supported legal reforms to make courts more accessible and less corrupt. He encouraged education and established a fund to support ministers and poor students. He sponsored arts and music, maintaining a court that, while more modest than Charles II's, still patronized culture. But he also ruled through major generals, military governors who enforced moral legislation, suppressed vice and disorder, and kept watch for royalist conspiracies. This military rule in the localities was resented by gentry and common people alike, feeling oppressive despite Cromwell's good intentions. Plots against Cromwell occurred regularly. Royalists never accepted the Protectorate's legitimacy and schemed constantly to assassinate Cromwell or raise rebellions. Syndicum's plot in 1657 came close to success. Conspirators planned to shoot Cromwell in Hyde Park or set fire to Whitehall Palace. Discovery and torture of conspirators revealed the extent of royalist networks. Republicans also plotted, angry that Cromwell had become what they saw as a dictator, betraying the good old cause of Commonwealth and religious liberty. These security threats required constant vigilance and an extensive intelligence network. John Thurlow, Cromwell's Secretary of State, ran an effective spy system that intercepted mail, infiltrated conspiracies, and gathered intelligence on threats domestic and foreign. This surveillance state was necessary for the Protectorate's survival, but created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. People watched what they said, knowing informers might report them. Opposition was driven underground rather than eliminated. Through all this, Cromwell aged rapidly. The strain of governing, the weight of responsibility, the endless decisions about life and death, executions of conspirators, wars and diplomacy, all took their toll. He suffered from various ailments, possibly malaria contracted in the Irish campaign, kidney stones, and recurring fevers. His daughter Elizabeth died in August 1658, a grief that shattered him. Cromwell had always been devoted to his family, maintaining simple domestic habits despite his power. Elizabeth's death seemed to break something in him. In late August 1658, Cromwell fell seriously ill with fever and infection. Doctors applied their useless remedies, purges, bloodletting, various concoctions, but nothing helped. Cromwell lingered for days, sometimes conscious and praying, sometimes delirious. On September 3rd, 1658, anniversary of his great victories at Dunbar and Worcester, Oliver Cromwell died at Whitehall Palace. He was 59 years old. He had been Lord Protector for less than 5 years, but he had dominated English politics for 15 years through civil war, revolution, and the building of the Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell's death created a power vacuum that the Protectorate could not survive. Before dying, Cromwell had nominated his eldest surviving son, Richard, to succeed him as Lord Protector. Richard Cromwell was proclaimed Protector immediately, and for a few months it seemed the transition might succeed. Richard was 32, intelligent and educated, personally pleasant, and untainted by involvement in the civil wars or his father's controversial actions. Perhaps he could provide a fresh start, consolidating the Protectorate into stable government. But Richard, called Tumbledown Dick by his critics, lacked his father's authority. He had never been a soldier, never commanded armies or won battles. The army officers who had followed Oliver out of respect and loyalty felt no such bond with Richard. He had not been active in politics, had no network of supporters, commanded no personal following. He was Protector only because his father named him, and without Oliver's personal prestige, that nomination meant little. The army and Parliament immediately began undermining Richard. Army officers demanded he recognize their independence, acknowledge their political role, grant them power to veto civilian government decisions. Parliament, dominated by conservatives who resented military influence, refused these demands and tried to assert civilian control over the military. Richard, caught between these factions, satisfied neither. He had neither the political skill to navigate these conflicts, nor the force of personality to impose his will. By April 1659, just 7 months after becoming Protector, Richard was forced to dissolve Parliament, but this left him dependent entirely on the army, which had no loyalty to him. The army command, led by generals who had served under Oliver, decided they no longer needed Richard. On May 25, 1659, Richard Cromwell resigned as Protector. He would live another 50 years in quiet obscurity, never attempting to reclaim power, perhaps relieved to escape the burden he had never wanted. With Richard gone, England descended into political chaos. The army recalled the Rump Parliament, those MPs purged in 1648 who had voted to try Charles I and establish the Commonwealth. The Rump tried to reassert authority, but they faced the same problems that had led to their dissolution in 1653. They represented a tiny fraction of the political nation, commanded little legitimacy, and were divided internally between radical Republicans and conservatives wanting stability. Through summer and autumn 1659, different factions maneuvered for advantage. The Rump Parliament clashed with army officers. Junior officers and radical soldiers demanded reforms, broader representation, religious liberty, social justice. Conservative officers feared radicalism and wanted order restored. London apprentices and citizens rioted, demanding a free parliament without military coercion. Royalist agents stirred discontent, distributing pamphlets and organizing conspiracies. Scotland and Ireland, held by military force, waited to see if England's government would collapse entirely. Regional armies added to the confusion. George Monk, an experienced general who had fought for both king and parliament, commanded the army in Scotland. Monk was conservative, disciplined, and deeply opposed to military rule and political radicalism. Through 1659, he watched events in London with growing concern. The Rump's weakness, the army's divisions, the political instability, all seemed likely to lead either to military dictatorship or renewed civil war. Monk concluded that restoration of monarchy might be the only path to stability. In January 1660, Monk marched his army from Scotland into England. This was a calculated risk. He did not know if other armies would support or oppose him, but Monk had prepared carefully, securing his troops' loyalty, promising them back pay, and framing his march as necessary to restore order and ensure a free parliament. Most other military units, tired of political chaos and radical agitation, did not oppose him. When Monk reached London in February 1660, he found the Rump Parliament still deadlocked and the city in turmoil. Londoners celebrated his arrival, hoping he would restore stability. Monk forced the Rump to readmit the MPs excluded in Pride's Purge in 1648, effectively reconstituting the Long Parliament. This enlarged Parliament immediately voted to dissolve itself and call fresh elections for a convention Parliament that would determine England's future government. The election campaign of 1660 revealed how thoroughly the revolution had failed to win popular support. Royalist candidates won overwhelmingly. After more than a decade of Commonwealth and Protectorate, most English people wanted monarchy restored. They were tired of military rule, tired of radical religion and social experimentation, tired of the taxes needed to maintain huge armies. They wanted familiar government, king, House of Lords, Church of England with its bishops and prayer book. Whether they actually loved monarchy or simply preferred it to continued instability, the result was the same: a decisive electoral mandate for restoration. Charles Stuart, living in impoverished exile in the Netherlands, watched these developments with barely contained excitement. He was 30 years old, had spent most of his adult life in exile, depending on the charity of foreign courts and supporters. Now suddenly, England was inviting him home. Through the spring of 1660, Charles negotiated with English envoys, careful not to seem too eager, insisting on terms that would protect his dignity and prerogatives. On April 4, 1660, Charles issued the Declaration of Breda, announcing his terms for restoration: pardon for most who had fought against his father, religious toleration for peaceful Protestants, no punishment for purchasers of confiscated lands unless Parliament so decided, and payment of army arrears. The Convention Parliament received the declaration favorably. On May 8, 1660, they formally proclaimed Charles Stuart as King Charles II, dating his reign from his father's execution in 1649, as if the Commonwealth had never legally existed. Monk was sent to escort Charles from the Netherlands. On May 25, 1660, Charles's 30th birthday, the king landed at Dover. Monk knelt before him. Charles, with characteristic cynicism, remarked that the fault for his long exile must be his own, since everyone claimed they had always wanted his restoration. Charles's journey from Dover to London was a triumphal procession. Crowds lined the roads, cheering, throwing flowers, celebrating the return of monarchy. Church bells rang, bonfires blazed, wine flowed freely in the streets. It was as if the entire nation sought to forget the revolutionary decades, to pretend the Commonwealth had been an aberration, a bad dream from which they had finally awakened. On May 29th, his 30th birthday, Charles entered London in a spectacular procession, richly dressed, mounted on a fine horse, preceded by regiments of cavalry, and followed by members of Parliament and the nobility. The restoration was complete. But restoration did not mean simple return to the past. Too much had changed. Too much blood had been shed. Too many conflicting interests now demanded accommodation. Charles II was not his father. He had learned from Charles I's mistakes. He would be flexible where his father had been rigid, cynical where his father had been sincere, willing to maneuver and compromise where his father had insisted on principle. Charles II's motto would be that he had no desire to go on his travels again. He would do whatever necessary to keep his throne and avoid his father's fate. The Restoration settlement punished some, but pardoned most. The surviving regicides, those who had signed Charles I's death warrant and could be captured, were tried for treason. 10 were executed with the horrific traitor's death, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Others were imprisoned for life. Some had fled abroad and died in exile. A few, including Cromwell's son Henry, who had governed Ireland, received pardons through political connections or services to the Restoration. In a macabre act of vengeance, the corpses of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw were exhumed from Westminster Abbey, hanged at Tyburn, and beheaded. Their heads were displayed on poles at Westminster Hall, Cromwell's remaining there for 25 years until it blew down in a storm. It was petty and cruel, vengeance on dead men who could not defend themselves, but it satisfied some royalists' need for retribution. The new model army, that formidable force that had won the civil wars and dominated English politics for years, was disbanded. Most soldiers were sent home with partial back pay and promises of indemnity for wartime actions. A few regiments were retained and reorganized as the foundation for a new royal standing army. Officers like Monk, who had facilitated the Restoration, received titles and rewards. Others melted back into civilian life, trying to forget their revolutionary service. The Church of England was restored with its bishops and traditional liturgy. The Act of Uniformity in 1662 required all ministers to accept the Book of Common Prayer and episcopal ordination. About 2,000 Puritan ministers refused and were ejected from their positions. They became nonconformists or dissenters, worshipping outside the established church despite laws restricting their freedom. The religious toleration Charles had promised in the Declaration of Breda proved hollow. Parliament and the restored bishops wanted conformity, and Charles, dependent on their support, could not or would not resist. The Convention Parliament was replaced by the Cavalier Parliament in 1661, dominated by Royalists and High Church Anglicans. This Parliament enacted harsh laws against dissenters. The Clarendon Code, named after Charles's chief minister, the Earl of Clarendon. These laws restricted nonconformist worship, banned their ministers from living near corporate towns, prohibited religious meetings except in Church of England services. Thousands of dissenters faced fines, imprisonment, or transportation for peacefully practicing their faith. Charles himself had few strong religious convictions. He had signed the Scottish Covenant in 1650 to gain Scottish support, had attended Anglican services in exile, and would secretly convert to Catholicism on his deathbed in 1685. His tolerance was more indifference than principle. He simply did not care much about religious doctrine, and wished people could worship as they pleased without disturbing civil peace. But he needed Parliament's money and support, so he accepted religious policies he privately considered foolish. The Restoration settlement also addressed property. During the Civil Wars and Commonwealth, much Royalist land had been confiscated and sold. Charles could not simply reverse all these sales without alienating powerful interests and creating chaos in land titles. Instead, a compromise was reached. Crown and church lands were restored. Royalists who had been forced to sell land to pay fines could attempt legal recovery, but those who had voluntarily sold their estates had no remedy. Those sales stood. This satisfied purchasers while allowing some Royalists to recover property, though it pleased no one completely. Politically, the Restoration meant the return of King and House of Lords. but Parliament's gains during the civil wars were largely preserved. Parliament's right to approve taxation was not questioned. Prerogative courts, like Star Chamber, which Charles I had used to bypass common law, were not restored. The principle that English government required both king and Parliament, not king alone, had been established through blood and revolution. Charles II would work with Parliament, not against it, understanding that monarchical authority had limits. The civil wars and the revolutionary decades had transformed England profoundly, though not always in ways revolutionaries had intended. Monarchy survived, but absolute monarchy was dead. The Church of England survived, but religious uniformity was impossible, despite legal persecution of dissenters. The social hierarchy survived, but the revolution had shown that traditional authority could be challenged, that common soldiers could elect representatives and debate politics, that radical religious and political ideas could spread beyond elite circles. The wars had also cost terribly. Perhaps 200,000 had died in combat or from disease and privation caused by armies marching across the land. Countless more bore physical and psychological scars. Regions where battles were fought or armies quartered suffered economic devastation that took decades to recover from. Families were divided by conflicting loyalties. The trauma would echo through generations. As evening settles over this long story, as we approach the gentle end of our journey through England's bloodiest century, it is worth pausing to consider what these tumultuous decades meant, what they changed, and what lessons they offer to those who came after. The Stuart Crisis and the English Civil Wars were not simply dramatic events that happened long ago in a distant kingdom. They shaped the modern world in profound ways, influencing political thought, constitutional development, and the very idea of what government should be and where its authority comes from. The most immediate legacy was constitutional. The English Civil Wars established beyond doubt that Parliament was essential to government, that kings could not rule without it, and that sovereignty rested ultimately not with the monarch alone, but with the monarch in Parliament. This principle, fought for with such bloodshed, became foundational to British constitutional development. Future monarchs would reign, but Parliament would increasingly govern. The balance of power shifted irreversibly toward representative institutions, though the process would take decades more to fully develop. The Civil Wars also established, though painfully and at tremendous cost, that political authority comes from consent rather than divine ordination alone. Charles I had believed utterly in his divine right, that God appointed him king, and he answered only to God. Parliament and the army challenged this, arguing that government exists to serve the people, that authority requires consent, that even kings can be held accountable. This revolutionary principle, though incompletely realized in the 17th century, would flower in later centuries into democratic ideas about popular sovereignty. Religious liberty, though not fully achieved during the revolutionary period, became an issue that could not be ignored. The proliferation of sects during the interregnum, the debates about toleration, Cromwell's own attempts to allow diverse Protestant worship, all these planted seeds that would eventually grow into modern religious freedom. The Clarendon Code and other restoration persecutions of dissenters provoked resistance and debate that would lead eventually to greater toleration. The wars influenced political thought profoundly. Thomas Hobbes, horrified by the chaos of civil war, wrote Leviathan, arguing for strong sovereign authority to prevent society from descending into violent anarchy. John Locke, growing up during the interregnum and Restoration, would develop ideas about natural rights, consent of the governed, and the right to resist tyrannical authority that would influence the American and French revolutions. The debates and pamphlets of the Civil War era formed a rich political tradition exploring questions about liberty, authority, rights, and the proper relationship between rulers and ruled. Militarily, the Civil Wars transformed warfare. The new model army's professional discipline, its promotion by merit, its training and organization, these became models for modern military forces. The British Army traces its origins to this period. The idea that an effective army required professional soldiers, regular pay, systematic training, and discipline, enforced by military law rather than social hierarchy, all emerged from the new model army's practices. Socially, the wars had mixed effects. The hierarchy of king, lords, and commons survived the revolution and was restored in 1660, yet the revolution had shown this hierarchy was not immutable, that common soldiers could debate politics, that radical ideas about equality and rights could find popular audiences. The genie of political consciousness among common people, once released, could never be completely returned to its bottle. Later reform movements would draw inspiration from leveler ideas about expanded suffrage and equal rights. The wars also left deep cultural marks. The King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, defended by Royalists and attacked by Puritans, became fixtures of English culture. Milton's poetry, shaped by his Republican convictions and disappointment at the Restoration, gave English literature some of its greatest works. The period's religious intensity, its apocalyptic hopes and fears, its sense that cosmic forces contended in earthly conflicts, all this shaped English Protestantism for generations. For Oliver Cromwell personally, the legacy is complex and contested. To his admirers, he was a champion of liberty, a brilliant general who saved England from tyranny, a sincere Christian who tried to govern righteously. His toleration of diverse Protestant worship was admirable for his era. His military genius was undeniable. His attempts to find constitutional solutions showed he valued law and consent, not just power. To his detractors, Cromwell was a hypocrite and military dictator who destroyed monarchy and parliament, then ruled as king in all but name. His brutalities in Ireland left lasting scars and justified bitterness. His use of military force to purge Parliament and impose his will contradicted his professed belief in consent and liberty. His failure to establish stable government meant the revolution collapsed at his death. The truth contains elements of both views. Cromwell was a complex man, sincerely religious yet politically ruthless, believing in liberty yet willing to use force when he thought necessary, genuinely reluctant to take power yet unable to resist when circumstances seemed to demand it. He was neither the hero his Victorian admirers made him, nor the villain of Catholic Irish memory. He was a revolutionary leader who, like many such figures, found that destroying an old order proved easier than building a new one, that ideals compromised by power, that the distance between aspiration and achievement could break even strong men. Charles I's reputation also evolved over time. Immediately after his execution, he became a martyr to royalists, a victim of illegal violence, a king who died defending law and liberty against revolutionary chaos. The Icon Basilique, a supposed autobiography published shortly after his death, portrayed Charles as a suffering king whose death paralleled Christ's martyrdom. This image had powerful effect, helping prepare the way for restoration. Later historians have been less sympathetic. Charles's inflexibility, his inability to compromise, his constant scheming, even while negotiating, These traits made civil war perhaps inevitable, and certainly prolonged it. His belief in divine right, sincere though it was, blinded him to political realities. A more flexible king might have avoided war or reached settlement without regicide. Charles's personal qualities, dignity, artistic taste, devotion to family, were admirable, but on political skills were disastrous. The civil wars also influenced the Atlantic world profoundly. Many participants emigrated during or after the conflicts. Royalists went to Virginia and the Caribbean, establishing plantation societies that would become slave-holding oligarchies. Puritans had already colonized New England, and the Civil Wars intensified religious migration. Ideas about liberty, representative government, and resistance to arbitrary power crossed the Atlantic, shaping colonial political cultures that would eventually produce the American Revolution. In Scotland and Ireland, the Civil War's legacies were particularly bitter. Scotland had fought alongside Parliament, only to be conquered by the Commonwealth and occupied. The Restoration relieved some grievances, but Scotland remained unhappy with English dominance. This tension would lead to the Act of Union in 1707, merging Scottish and English parliaments into a British parliament, creating the United Kingdom. Ireland suffered most terribly. Cromwell's conquest and the subsequent land confiscations transferred vast estates from Catholic to Protestant owners. This created a Protestant ascendancy that would dominate Irish politics for centuries, while the Catholic majority remained dispossessed and resentful. The Civil Wars thus laid foundations for centuries of sectarian conflict, rebellion, and tragedy in Ireland. The scars have still not fully healed. One curious legacy was the end of Scotland's separate foreign policy. Before 1707, Scotland and England, though sharing a monarch, were separate kingdoms with potentially different foreign policies. The Civil Wars and subsequent union ended this, incorporating Scotland into Britain's unified foreign and military policy. This would have profound implications for Scotland's development and for British imperial expansion. The Civil Wars also accelerated capitalism's development. The huge expense of war forced both sides to develop sophisticated systems for raising money, managing debt, and organizing supply. Parliament particularly innovated in public finance, creating excise taxes and other revenue sources that would become permanent. The efficiency with which the new model army was supplied and paid showed what could be accomplished with systematic administration. Religious ideas about providence, about God's will working through history, were reinforced or challenged by the war's outcomes. Parliamentarians saw their victories as divine judgment on tyranny. Cromwell attributed his success to God's providence. But the Restoration called these interpretations into question. If God had supported Parliament's cause, why was monarchy restored? Why did the Revolution fail? This paradox troubled English Protestants and complicated simple narratives about God's will in history. The memory of the Civil Wars remained politically charged for generations. Whigs, who supported Parliament's authority and feared royal tyranny, celebrated the Civil Wars as necessary resistance to absolutism. Tories, who valued order and traditional authority, saw the wars as catastrophic, proof of what happened when subjects questioned their betters. These interpretations shaped English politics through the 18th century and beyond. As industrialization transformed Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Civil Wars took on new meanings. Radical reformers looked back to levelers and diggers, seeing them as early Democrats suppressed by their own side. Chartists and socialists found inspiration in 17th-century debates about equality and rights. Conservatives warned that radical reform might lead to chaos like the Civil Wars. The past became a weapon in contemporary political battles. In the 20th century, Marxist historians interpreted the civil wars as a bourgeois revolution, the rising capitalist class overthrowing feudal monarchy. This interpretation dominated mid-20th century scholarship, but was later challenged by revisionist historians who argued the wars were more about religion and constitutional principles than economics. Debates continue, with each generation finding new meanings in these 17th century conflicts. For Americans, the Civil Wars hold particular significance. The American colonists inherited English political culture shaped by the Civil Wars. Ideas about representative government, the right to resist tyranny, the necessity of checks on executive power, all had roots in 17th century England. When Americans declared independence and framed their Constitution, they drew on traditions established in the Stuart Crisis and Civil Wars. The Second Amendment's provision for militias reflects English debates about standing armies. The separation of powers echoes concerns about concentrated authority. Many specific, constitutional provisions respond to problems that emerged in 17th century England. The Civil Wars also remind us that constitutional development often comes through crisis and conflict, rather than peaceful evolution. England did not gradually and peacefully transition from absolute to constitutional monarchy. It required civil war, regicide, experiment with republic, restoration, and another revolution in 1688 before the constitutional settlement stabilized. Change came through struggle, sometimes violent struggle, not through the gradual unfolding of inevitable progress. There are lessons here about the difficulty of political transformation. The revolutionaries of the 1640s wanted to create a just society based on law and liberty, but they found that destroying an old order was easier than building a new one. Without agreed sources of legitimacy, government rested on force. Without broad consensus about political and religious goals, revolution fractured into competing factions. The army that won the war became a problem in peace, too powerful to disband, too expensive to maintain, too radical for most people's comfort. These problems plague many revolutions. The wars also show the danger of inflexibility. Charles I's rigid commitment to divine right prevented compromises that might have avoided war or ended it sooner with less bloodshed. His inability to read political reality, to understand that traditional authority had weakened, that his subjects would resist arbitrary power, this blindness cost him his throne and life. Political wisdom requires not just principle, but also prudent judgment about when to stand firm and when to bend. Conversely, Cromwell's inability to establish lasting institutions shows the limits of personal rule. Cromwell was genuinely talented, militarily brilliant, politically astute in many ways, sincerely religious, but his system depended on his personal authority. When he died, it collapsed immediately because it had no legitimacy beyond him. Stable government requires institutions, traditions, and broad consent, not just charismatic leadership. The war's religious dimensions remind us how deeply belief systems shape politics. For 17th century English people, religion was not a private matter separate from politics. It determined how they understood authority, society, morality, and destiny. Conflicts over ceremonies and church governance were never merely theological disputes. They were battles about power, community, and England's identity. Any attempt to understand the civil wars that ignores religion misses much of what motivated participants. Yet the wars also showed the danger of religious certainty in politics. When people believe God is on their side, that their cause is sacred, compromise becomes betrayal of divine will. Both sides in the civil wars claimed God's blessing. Both saw opponents not just as political rivals, but as enemies of truth and righteousness. This absolutism made negotiation difficult and fed the conflict's intensity and duration. The Civil War's greatest legacy, perhaps, was proving that England would have limited monarchy and representative government. After the trauma of civil war, regicide, failed republic, and restoration, neither crown nor parliament could claim absolute authority. They would have to share power, negotiate, compromise. This was not the outcome revolutionaries had planned, nor what royalists had wanted, but it emerged from their conflict. The English developed through suffering a system of balanced power that would influence constitutional development worldwide. And so, dear listener, as the night deepens around you and your breathing slows towards sleep, we come to the end of our long journey through England's most turbulent century. We have walked alongside kings and common soldiers, watched battles fought on misty fields, stood in Westminster Hall as a king was tried, and witnessed a revolution rise and fall. These were not abstract historical forces, but real people, men and women with hopes and fears, beliefs and doubts, courage and weakness, navigating extraordinary circumstances as best they could. King Charles the Learned, born weak and sickly in a cold Scottish palace, grew to believe utterly in his divine right to rule. His sincere convictions and fatal inflexibility led to civil war, regicide, and the brief abolition of monarchy itself. Yet in his death, he found a dignity that his reign had lacked, dying bravely for principles he held sacred, becoming a martyr to those who valued traditional order. Oliver Cromwell, the country gentleman who became a cavalry commander at 43 and transformed English warfare, showed that discipline and religious conviction could triumph over aristocratic privilege and long military tradition. His victories at Marston Moor, Naseby, Dunbar, and Worcester broke the king's armies and proved Parliament could win. Yet when military victory gave him power, Cromwell struggled to build stable government. His protectorate, resting on his personal authority, collapsed at his death, teaching that lasting institutions require more than talented leadership. The new model army, those redcoats who revolutionized English military tradition, proved that professional soldiers, properly paid and trained, could defeat aristocratic cavalry and feudal levies. Their debates about politics and religion showed that common soldiers could think deeply about governance and rights. Yet their political power threatened to create military dictatorship, illustrating that armies, however necessary to win wars, make dangerous governors in peacetime. Parliament, that ancient assembly, successfully resisted what it saw as royal tyranny, won a civil war, and abolished monarchy. Yet Parliament itself, divided into factions, was purged by military force and proved unable to govern effectively without king or protector. The revolution showed that parliamentary government alone was not enough. Stable governance required balanced power, shared between Crown and Parliament, each checking the other's excesses. The people of England, caught between great forces they could not control, suffered through years of war, occupation by armies, crushing taxation, religious upheaval, and political instability. Many probably cared little about constitutional theories or theological disputes. They wanted peace, stable prices, and to be left alone to work their land or trade. Their sufferings remind us that political conflicts, however necessary their advocates believe them to be, impose terrible costs on ordinary people who just want to live their lives. The religious radicals, Puritans, Independents, Baptists, Levelers, Quakers, showed that diversity of belief cannot be suppressed permanently, that when given freedom, people will explore different paths to truth. Their debates about liberty of conscience, about separation of church and state, about individual rights, planted seeds that would flower in later centuries into modern religious freedom and democratic principles. Scotland and Ireland, dragged into England's conflicts against their will, suffered conquest and occupation. Scotland's covenant was betrayed, its army defeated, its independence compromised. Ireland's Catholic majority was dispossessed, its people brutalized, creating wounds that would fester for centuries. The Civil Wars remind us that British history was never just English history. Scotland and Ireland had their own stories, their own grievances, their own tragedies in these events. What, then, should we take from this long story as we drift towards sleep? Perhaps simply this: that change, even necessary change, comes hard and costly. That principles matter, but so does wisdom about when to stand firm and when to compromise. That religious conviction can inspire nobility, but also fuel intolerance. That military victory does not automatically translate into political success. That stable government requires not just power, but legitimacy. Not just force, but consent. Not just brilliant individuals, but enduring institutions. The Stuart Crisis and English Civil Wars changed Britain and influenced the world. They helped establish constitutional monarchy, representative government, and debates about liberty that echo through modern democracy. They showed that kings could be held accountable, that subjects had rights worth defending, that political authority required consent. These were revolutionary ideas purchased with blood and suffering, refined through decades of conflict and failure, finally achieving partial realization after the trauma had ended. Yet the revolution also showed the limits of human ability to reshape society according to ideals. The revolutionaries wanted to create a godly Commonwealth, a just society based on liberty and law. Instead, they got civil war, military dictatorship, failed experiments in government, and ultimately restoration of much they had fought to abolish. Their ideals were genuine, their sacrifices real, but the gap between aspiration and achievement humbled them. This gap, this recognition that human plans go awry, that good intentions produce unintended consequences, that perfection remains forever just beyond reach. This, too, is part of the Civil War's legacy. As you settle deeper into your pillow, let these long-ago events fade into the background of consciousness. The battles are over, the armies disbanded, the revolutionaries and kings long dead. What remains are lessons, memories, influences that shaped the world we inhabit. The English people survived their civil wars, rebuilt their society, learned painfully what kinds of government could endure and what would collapse. Their struggles, their sufferings, their arguments and battles, all these contributed to developing ideas about liberty and justice that we inherit. Let yourself now release these thoughts. Allow the images of 17th century England, the misty battlefields, the crowded parliament, the solemn execution, the weary soldiers marching home, to dissolve into peaceful darkness. History's lessons are important, but rest is also necessary. The past speaks to us, teaches us, but we need not carry its burdens into our dreams. Sleep now, gentle listener. Let the Stuart Crisis, the English Civil Wars, the Commonwealth and Protectorate, the Restoration. Let all these dramatic events recede like distant thunder after a storm has passed. The stories are told, the lessons offered, the long journey through history's violent chapters complete. What remains is the quiet of night, the comfort of your bed, the peace of letting go and allowing sleep to come softly, naturally, carrying you into restorative darkness where no wars rage, no kings are tried, no revolutions tear kingdoms apart. Rest well, knowing that those distant conflicts, terrible as they were, helped shape a world where representative government, constitutional limits on power, and debates about liberty became possible. Their struggles were real, their sufferings genuine, but they are past. You are here, now, safe in this moment, drifting peacefully towards sleep. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle, your rest deep, and your morning bright. Thank you for traveling with me through this long historical journey. Until we meet again for another soothing tale from history's quiet corners, sleep well. The Sleepy Crown family wishes you the most peaceful slumber.